Kent Police, where's your emergency?
Hiya, who do I report a missing person to?
Who's actually missing?
It's my wife. She walked out early hours Wednesday morning and she ain't been back since.
It didn't add up. Why would she be gone for so long and why wouldn't she tell anyone?
Maybe she had mental health issues and she had enough.
Some people do find they can't cope with the pressures of life and wander off.
The police, they were searching the area with sniffer dogs, police helicopter.
It was much worse than we thought.
And I was like, am I under arrest then?
In the heart of the Kent countryside lies the quaint village of Northbourne.
It's a very picturesque village, very rural setting, close to the coast, and actually a lovely place to be. Lots of nice walks through the fields and woodland nearby.
Everybody knows everybody. There is that sense of community and a sense of it being a safe environment.
We have quite a nice village hall in a pub, surrounded by farmland. It's quite a nice, quiet place to live. Crime is not generally a problem here.
With such a welcoming community, it was the perfect place for Micah Cudworth to set up home.
Micah was born in Poland, but she came to live in Kent, and she came to see Kent as being her home.
She came over presumably to have a better life, to have a new adventure, and settled here and was well known and liked here.
She didn't come to England on her own. She was married before, and she came with the partner that she had at the time. But they separated, and she met Jonathan.
John was obviously a local lad and lived in this area all his life as far as he went to school in the area, joined the military, came out of that eventually and got a job here as a forklift truck driver.
Jonathan is a really sweet kid. He is really gentle, quite quiet, very reserved. And he came from a nice family. They were all good people.
With an opportunity for a second chance at love. In 2013, Micah and Jonathan tied the knot. And she found a safe haven with her new extended family in Kent.
Micah's family still lived in Poland. Her only family in England was actually Jonathan's family. She deemed her friends in England to be her family, so living and remaining here was important to her.
She was very involved with his family. They were like one big family, and I think she loved that. I think that's what her intention of coming here. She wanted that family sentiment, and, you know, she got that.
It didn't take long for the happy couple to settle in well to village life.
Mikey was beautiful, funny, fun-loving. She was just a real bright energy. She could make you laugh, make you smile.
They were an ordinary young couple which was missing in the village. So it was nice, it was a pleasure to see them.
Micah and Jonathan were a devoted couple.
As any normal couple would. They'd walk down to the end of the road. Micah would go rushing off wherever work. She'd always smile. She'd always, put her hand up. John, I would see occasionally on his way down to the pub, and occasionally on the way back from the pub.
And it wasn't long before Micah took up part-time work, which put her centre stage in the community.
She had a job as a barmaid in a village pub. You know, lots and lots of people would go in that pub. Quite a small size, but with a lovely big garden. And I think in that pub, it's very close-knit, you know, it's very friendly. And to have had very friendly, bubbly and attractive barmaid there, she would have been a very well-known and very well-liked girl.
8 years since her move from Poland, Micah appeared happy with her life in the UK. But she may not have been as content as it seemed.
Kent Police, where's your emergency?
Hiya, who do I report a missing person to?
Who's actually missing?
It's my wife. She came home about 11:30 because she went to meet somebody for a drink. We had a little bit of a row and she stormed off and she ain't been back since.
So is she vulnerable in any way due to disability, mental health, or any other factors?
She has been a bit down lately.
Okay.
Micah had gone out after work and had a drink with a friend. She'd come home late. They'd had an argument. She'd stormed off. The next day, she was still missing. And then the following morning, Jonathan reported her as missing.
Worried about Micah's whereabouts, officers do a quick search of the house for clues. They discover she had taken just a few essentials with her, keys and a handbag. But her car is still in the driveway and her mobile phone is switched off. Concerned about her state of mind, officers speak to villagers for clues.
My neighbour next door to me told me Micah had gone missing. The police came round, explained what they were doing, interviewed us all.
You know, asking the questions. Have you seen anything? Have you heard anything?
But with no information from neighbours, concern grows as to Micah's whereabouts and her state of mind. Kent Police decide to issue a missing persons appeal to the public.
We received a press release from police to say that Micah had gone missing. It's human instinct, so it instantly struck a chord and we thought, something's wrong here. It didn't add up. Why would she be gone for so long and why wouldn't she tell anyone?
Naturally, you think, God, this woman must be so unwell. Maybe she had mental health issues and she kind of like had enough and left the house in the middle of the night. It was sad.
Kent Police, where's your emergency?
Hiya, who do I report a missing person to?
Who's actually missing?
In the quaint village of Northbourne, unease is growing over Micah Cudworth's whereabouts. She's been missing for more than 24 hours.
In the village, there was a real concern as to where Micah might be.
From our point of view, it was a case each day we wanted to know where was Micah, had she been found?
Concerned about her state of mind, her loving husband Jonathan has reported her missing. Worried that her low mood had led her to look for comfort outside of the family home.
So is she vulnerable in any way?
No, but she has been a bit down lately.
Okay.
You don't know, but it wouldn't be unusual. It could be some form of mental illness. Some people can't cope with the normal pressures of life and wander off.
Life gets difficult and life gets tough, which it does for all of us, and we all face challenging circumstances in our lives.
Having walked out in the middle of the night after an argument, the village can't imagine what's going through her husband's mind.
I actually reached out to John and said, hey, this is really terrible. And I remember saying to him, you know, just hang on, and hopefully she's going to find her and she'll get the help that she needs.
After 24 hours with no contact from Micah and with no clues to her whereabouts, police start considering the possibility she could have harmed herself or met someone out to cause her harm. A full-scale search is launched.
Suddenly, lots of police vans turn up. From seeing no police cars or hardly any police cars to being descended on by police was a little bit of a shock.
The police, they were searching the area nearby. That was with sniffer dogs, police helicopter.
You bring in resources, dogs, police dogs, searching fields, especially in the rural area of East Kent, there's a vast amount of agriculture. You might get the helicopter camera up with the infrared to see if you can find someone in the field somewhere and still alive.
Police continue to scour the surrounding areas and question Micah's family and friends. But it appears after walking out into the night, she simply disappeared.
Generally speaking, most missing persons turn up very shortly, certainly within, if not 24 hours sooner. This was then 30-odd hours. And then, of course, 36, 48 hours. And you always live in hope. But, of course, the longer it goes on, you always fear the worst.
As the days pass, husband Jonathan and the rest of the family desperately cling on for any hope that Micah will be found safe and well.
I was devastated for him. I felt for him, I felt for his family. I just wanted to help them, support them.
We responded as best we could, and the church was open. We had a small little area as a place where people could come for prayer and reflection.
As the local search fails to uncover any clue as to where Micah has gone, detectives decide to increase the media campaign with the hope of reaching out nationally and internationally.
Police are urging anyone who may have seen Micah Cudworth to contact them. The barmaid walked out of her home just before midnight on Tuesday and hasn't been seen since. Polish-born Micah from Northbourne was last seen wearing white trainers, grey tracksuit bottoms and carrying a black handbag.
When the police released her photograph, that's when the public interest really did peak. She looked like a bubbly, happy, kind and well-liked person. So the public interest really did come alive.
There was a lot of talk on social media. You can imagine when you live in these little villages, somebody goes missing and the local newspaper saying, have you seen this person? It was everywhere.
Media campaigns are important, and very often by media campaigns and using the local media especially, you get sightings. The trouble with sightings is you can very often get people ringing in with genuine callers who believe they've seen perhaps the missing person when in fact it's not them at all. So you have to be careful that you're not taken down blind alleys.
And the longer Micah remains missing, the more rumours start to circulate throughout the village.
I think Micah, in the crudest sense, ticked a lot of boxes. As a barmaid, she would have been very popular. She was pretty attractive and supposedly quite bubbly, so she would have been very liked.
Rumours are rife, and particularly in a village. People start talking, she was a little bit too fond of a customer down at the pub.
She was very friendly with certain individuals, and one man in particular, and it was suspected by some people that she was having an affair.
Could Micah be with this man? Had she walked out into the arms of a new lover? Suddenly, there's hope this could be the case. A post from Micah appears on social media, written in Polish.
Micah's friends had received Facebook messages from Micah saying, "It's okay, I'm all right, I just need some space." But that hope was soon dashed when the friends had spoken to police to say that the messages they'd received weren't quite grammatically correct.
Some of her friends were questioning the grammatical use of Polish. It wasn't her usual way of speaking, as it were, on messages.
They couldn't see that Micah would have written them like that, and something just wasn't adding up.
Clearly, if she was sending these messages out, they weren't being sent by her.
But if it isn't her, then who is writing these messages? Detective suspicion that something sinister has happened to Micah grows. And they widen their inquiries and home in on certain people.
The persons of interest would have been the man from the pub who was allegedly having an affair with her, and indeed any other customers that would be regular customers in the pub, because if she's having an affair with somebody, there'll be other customers in the pub who will be able perhaps to provide some significant information with regard to their friendship.
Police trace the man Micah is suspected of having an affair with. He admits he had a drink with Micah on the night of her disappearance. He is questioned. Concerned by the latest development, Micah and Jonathan's friends and family rally round him.
Jonathan had called some friends and asked them to come round and give him support. They came round and they spent time with him.
4 days after Micah was reported missing, Kent police make a shocking announcement.
Police investigating the disappearance of 36-year-old Micah Cudworth have said they've made an arrest. The barmaid from Northbourne went missing 5 days ago and hasn't been sighted since. Police say they are growing increasingly concerned for Miss Cudworth's safety.
What's transpired, it was, yes, much worse than we thought.
Kent Police, where's your emergency?
It's my wife. She walked out early hours Wednesday morning and she ain't been back since.
In the Kent village of Northbourne, police investigating the disappearance of barmaid Micah Cudworth now suspect she may have been murdered. Believing messages Micah sent her friends after she went missing were actually sent by someone else, police question a man she was suspected of having an affair with.
The police released a statement to say that they'd arrested somebody, a man, in connection with Micah's disappearance.
But the man they arrested is not her suspected lover, but her husband, Jonathan Cudworth.
One of John's sisters said he'd been arrested, and I was like, what?
The news sends shockwaves across the village. How could this loving husband have anything to do with her disappearance?
It's hard to describe, really. It's just a lot of disbelief, I think.
The initial reaction for people in the immediate vicinity would be shock, surprise, nice couple.
When somebody's been arrested in connection with someone's disappearance, the public interest really does step up. That's what people then really start to talk about at the school gates, in the pub.
As rumours circulate around the village, it is revealed that Jonathan has been arrested on suspicion of GBH after police visited his house and noticed drops of blood by the front door, with Jonathan admitting that he had a minor altercation before Micah stormed off. Officers secure the house as a potential crime scene and carry out a search of an outbuilding.
And it was outside by the shed that they found some drops of blood.
Inside the outbuilding, officers discover a blood-stained doormat and cat basket. Both items are immediately seized and taken for forensic testing.
I would think that was the time that this became a homicide murder investigation.
Gradually, the realisation came that she may have actually been killed, and the police presence was becoming, in that sense, rather more sinister.
In custody, police believe the evidence points to Jonathan having more than just hit Micah.
During police interviews, he strenuously denied that he had anything to do with Micah's disappearance.
Jonathan, he was a nice lad. He wasn't mean. I don't remember him being aggressive or angry or volatile.
Jonathan admits he has Micah's Facebook password and posted messages pretending to be from her in Polish. But he says it was to stop her friends from harassing him. He says the blood found was from a minor altercation. Police decide to charge him with murder. But there's one problem. 7 days since she was last seen, there's still no sign of Micah, dead or alive. Officers widen their search both inside Micah's home and the surrounding areas. And suddenly, there's a breakthrough. A large amount of blood is discovered in the sitting room beneath the rug. And more blood is found in the boot of the family car. Police discover Jonathan had bought the rug in nearby Sandwich after Micah had gone missing. Slowly, they start to piece together Jonathan's movements since Micah's disappearance. The search for her is becoming desperate, and the family turn to their friend Ali.
Ali Austin is a psychic. She was contacted by Jonathan's family and asked if she would be able to help in the search for Micah.
So to label myself, I'm a fortune teller. I'm a psychic, I'm a clairvoyant, a clairaudient. I see, hear and sense things. And a message came through, and it was from one of John's sisters. And it said, "Hi Ali, is there any chance you can do a reading for me?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." And they were like, "Would you come out and search with us?" And I was like, "Of course I'm going to come out and search with you." And then we went off and we continued to search for 16, 17 hours a day.
We have known of a psychic being brought in before to help try to locate a body. The body has never been found, but sometimes that can be of help to the family because they feel that they're getting somebody to help them. When somebody has lost a member of their family, they will cling on to any kind of hope that they might still be alive.
I just wanted to help this family. I was just like, these poor people, this is horrific. She needs to be laid to rest. And that was all I focused on.
As Ali joins the search for Micah, along with family and friends, police discover video evidence from the night following Micah's disappearance.
A friend of mine, he had a CCTV, which was pointing out to the road. And I think it was John said he didn't go out of the property on that particular night, but it proved to be just after 2 o'clock, I think, in the morning, there was his car going by.
Detectives believe the 10-minute trip is significant in their hunt for Micah and concentrate their search to a 5-minute drive of the house. Further CCTV from earlier that day also proves key to the case against Jonathan.
There is capture of CCTV images from various areas, which includes him in a shop buying cleaning materials and attending a Deal pier, throwing items which turn out, we think, to be a handbag and a phone off the end of the pier.
I think that that's a vital cog that it enabled this investigation to keep on turning and for them to find out what had actually happened.
With police believing the CCTV proves Jonathan is responsible for Micah's disappearance, it also shows he made a trip to a refuse tip with multiple large bags. The search for Micah shifts to a landfill site. As the police search spreads, Ali Austin is concentrating her search in Eastry, where Jonathan grew up.
Quite a few of us were out, and I was like, why don't I try dowsing? Dowsing is a method that has been used for centuries to find objects. Even when I say it, it sounds ridiculous, but we had nothing to lose. I was exhausted. We were in a field, and there was me and Jonathan's sisters, and I used this ring. So I took this ring, and you hold it. So we had this map, and I just got everyone to close their eyes and concentrate, and I was like, just say Micah, like, where are you? So we were sitting there, and I'll be honest, even I'm like, this is ridiculous, you know, this is ridiculous. And the ring stopped on a point on the map, on a roundabout.
Ali and the family make their way to the roundabout and immediately begin to comb the surrounding fields.
I just remember pulling up and I ran off away from my car, and it was a rape field and it was like 5 foot high, and you can't move. I've never been in a rape field. You can't move in that stuff. It's all intertwined. And I remember like literally being like this in the field, running like in a zigzag. And then the next thing I know, I was standing on her. And she was in the field. So when I found her, I just remember screaming to everybody. I found her and told everybody not to move and not to come. But that was the point that her body had been abandoned, yes. And this is where we waited, and obviously it was, from that point, it was a crime scene. I didn't even think about what would happen if I did actually find her. I never gave that a thought. But then when I'm standing there, looking at her, 12 days after her life was taken, I can never unsee that.
Kent police have said that the body of a woman found in a field near Eastry in Kent is that of missing 36-year-old Micah Cudworth.
The news that everyone feared has now become a reality.
There was a real sense of grief and loss. For that to happen was, really quite shocking for people and disturbing. It's a sort of incident you would more likely expect to happen in a big city.
It's a sad thing more than anything else. And Micah was suddenly not being here anymore. It was upsetting, and there was a certain disbelief with that. When you lose anybody in a community, it's tragic, very tragic.
Micah's body is taken to the mortuary, where a post-mortem is carried out to determine a cause of death.
The post-mortem reveals Micah was stabbed, I think, 4 times. It would appear she lost half the blood in her body. The injuries she sustained as a result of those stab wounds were clearly fatal.
With Jonathan already in custody, detectives turn their attention to the circumstances surrounding the discovery of Micah's body, and specifically Ali Austin's involvement.
This psychic that comes into the frame. Used to go to school, I think, with Cudworth. She practices her psychic medium, and apparently, as a result of some readings that she's done, she finds the body before the police. It's bizarre, absolutely bizarre. I would certainly be having the lady in for questioning.
Suddenly, Ali Austin finds herself at the centre of a murder investigation.
I was told to present myself at Folkestone Police Station, and I rode to Folkestone Police Station on my motorbike the next morning. And I was showed to a room, and there was 2 or 3 kind of like detectives there. And the next thing I know, they've brought all these maps out, and they're going to me, put a black cross where your mum and dad's house is. So I was like, okay. So I looked at this massive aerial map. I put a black cross where my mum and dad's. They went, put a black cross where Jonathan Cudworth's mum and dad's house is. So I put a black cross where they live. Put a black cross where you found Micah. So I did that. And I remember at that point something in my head going, this isn't right. This is not, why are you asking me this? This is ridiculous. And then I asked for a break, and I went to get my cigarettes from my crash helmet, and they went, leave your helmet here. And I was like, pardon? And they were like, can you leave your helmet, please? And I was like, why, am I under arrest then? And they were like, no, but you're not allowed to leave.
Ali Austin's involvement sparks a lot of interest from the national media.
It had all of the ingredients for a juicy murder story. The first thing you think is the husband's done it. But then, you know, a psychic sniffs out the body. That is the sort of thing that, whether people believe it or not, you know, they're interested in and they want to read, they want to find out everything. It refreshed the story.
But Ali's potential involvement is soon eclipsed following a revelation that on the night of the 10th of May, Jonathan had called a family member from prison and made a startling admission.
He admitted to the crime, the killing.
During the call, Jonathan disclosed the area where he dumped Micah's body. Using this vital info, his family had then turned to Ali to help pinpoint the exact spot. Following this revelation, the police are happy she played no other part.
I do believe I was a suspect. I'm like, you know, local psychic. Maybe I put her there and then wanted the glory of, like, I found a body. Morally, like, that just rips my soul to pieces to think that at some point in a police interview room or a police station somewhere genuinely believed that I might have played a part in putting that woman there. But they don't know me. There was a lot of coincidences. You know, I can't deny that.
With Micah's body discovered and Jonathan charged, the question remains, why did this loving husband murder his wife? And how? Jonathan Cudworth has been charged with the murder of his wife, Micah. Despite the evidence against him, Jonathan pleads not guilty to murder. He claims diminished responsibility because of a momentary loss of control, and the case is sent for trial.
Having admitted to the killing and even charged with murder, it's then, of course, up to a judge and a jury, isn't it? That's all the police can do, is put forward the facts, the evidence that they can obtain, and any explanation that the defendant may give.
On the 7th December 2015, the trial begins at Canterbury Crown Court. And the question on everyone's lips is, what could have possibly led to Jonathan losing control and killing his wife, Micah?
John had a trust issues. You know, he didn't trust Micah. He thought Micah was having an affair.
My neighbour, you know, said that there was problems, probably with their marriage. He'd heard them arguing. She met somebody else, which was one of the reasons for the domestics.
So police found that Jonathan had been tracking Micah's whereabouts through a phone app, which suggests that he had a growing sense of paranoia about where she was, what she was doing, and who she was spending time with.
The court hears what Micah and Jonathan had been arguing about the night she was killed.
Jonathan had been questioning Micah about where she'd been and who she'd been with. And he lashed out in a jealous rage.
The jury hears Jonathan's prepared statement, claiming that Micah had admitted to an affair and was goading him aggressively. The defence being that he momentarily lost control.
Jonathan said that Micah had become aggressive, and he, as a reaction, had felt around for the weapon, and he'd hit her.
This was some tragic crime of passion, that he was actually the victim of this really strong-willed woman that was having an affair. They rowed, he's gone mad, and he's put a knife in her.
The court is stunned to hear Jonathan's version of events. But had he really killed her in a moment of madness?
Crimes of passion, of course they can occur, you know. None of us could say we haven't got it in us. There's people, they might do something in the heat of the moment, regret it, oh, no, and go, oh, my God, this has happened. It could happen to a lot of people in all different scenarios.
However, details from the post-mortem are read out in court, which questions Jonathan's defence, that he simply lashed out. Not only had Micah suffered a blunt force hit to the head, but she had bruises to her wrists and neck, along with a knife attack that the prosecution claim intended to end her life.
I realised that a crime of passion, a mistake, is maybe lashing out, pushing, shoving. Maybe he was cutting apples at the time, maybe he did have a knife in his hand. But she was stabbed 4 times. So she's been stabbed through her heart and then continuously stabbed on the upper part of her body, which corresponds with what my eyes saw.
And soon it becomes clear that Jonathan has a checkered history with relationships.
Police subsequently found out that there was a loose history of domestic violence, which included another ex-girlfriend and Micah herself.
The court hears there had been one prior report to the police of a domestic verbal altercation between Jonathan and Micah.
Micah notified the police that she was a victim of domestic abuse and that she lived in fear of Jonathan. This wasn't a random crime of passion.
It appears Micah and Jonathan's relationship had broken down completely, and she had made plans to leave him.
Since speaking to her family and her friends, she'd visited Poland 2 weeks before her death. She was leaving him. She'd saved £700, hidden in a drawer. She was going to be free of him. It is alleged that she had met somebody else, and whether she was going to have a life with them, I don't know. And she was confident that it was over. She returned to England, ready to prepare to start her new life.
But before Micah could move on without Jonathan in her life, events conspired to stop her in her tracks on the night of the 29th of April.
She'd been working at the local pub, and she came home sometime around 11:30, 12 o'clock.
Phone analysis from that evening reveals that Jonathan had become more and more irate as the evening wore on, and was continually asking where Micah was in text messages.
It transpired in court that after Jonathan had killed Micah, he dragged her body to a compost heap in the garden and left her there while he worked out how to dispose of her body.
I believe she was behind the shed and he covered her body in grass cuttings. Everyone was around, and that is where she lay.
On the next day, Cudworth has then got rid of her handbag and phone off the end of the pier and bought some cleaning up materials from a local shop.
And then he loaded Micah's body into the back of the car and drove her off to the field where he disposed of her.
The following morning, Jonathan calls the police to report Micah missing.
Kent Police, where's your emergency?
It's my wife. She walked out early hours Wednesday morning and she ain't been back since.
So is she vulnerable in any way?
No, but she has been a bit down lately.
Okay.
The extent that Jonathan had gone to conceal the fact that he had taken Micah's life. He'd tried to cover his tracks by sending messages to her friends. I get the feeling from this behaviour that it's very calculated, it's cold, and it shows no remorse.
During a gruelling trial at Canterbury Crown Court, the evidence against Jonathan appears overwhelming. A sustained, brutal attack on Micah, covering his tracks by disposing of Micah's body and her belongings, as well as a checkered history of past relationships. The jury retires to consider its verdict. Jonathan is found not guilty of Micah Cudworth's murder.
We were so surprised. We thought that there'd been such a strong case for murder against Jonathan, and to find out that he'd been found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter.
As he admitted to stabbing and killing his wife before the trial, the jury accepts his version of events, that of killing her through diminished responsibility.
I think Mr. Cudworth was an extremely lucky person to get off a murder charge. Very lucky, I think, because I've seen cases where, similar sort of things, and jury have come back guilty of murder.
With the lesser conviction of manslaughter, Jonathan is sentenced to 15 years in prison.
It's appalling. It is appalling. How can her life be worth 15 years? How do we stop this? How do we deter people from going that far? We need stricter sentences. A life should mean life.
Even with the case behind them, the local community still feel the impact of Micah's death.
The sad thing with an event like this is it just has really horrible consequences for everybody. For the families trying to move forward in this situation, and it leaves a scar on the community.
It's her resting place, isn't it? It's not ideal. I know her resting place, final resting place, is now in Poland, as it should be, but it's where her story ended, isn't it? And it should never have been that way. She didn't deserve this. Regardless of whether or not she was leaving him, regardless of whether or not she was dating somebody else, the penalty that she paid was atrocious. And it will stay with us, it will stay with me. It's an absolute tragedy, and it's a tragedy for our community.
Every shift brings more crime shockers than the last. Join the team and keep them in line Saturday at 10 p.m. in The Force, North East.
I remember working at the pub and started hearing rumours.
Mum, dad, 2 children slaughtered in their own home.
Massive shock to the local community that something so awful could happen to such a lovely family.
This was an all-out slaughter of 4 people.
No one really knew what had happened, how it had happened, or why it had happened.
Are the family involved in some way with organised crime? Is this a contract killing because it's so brutal?
A family wiped out and a man going missing leaves the community asking questions.
Detectives were left pondering, was this missing persons case linked to a quadruple murder case?
There was a point in this inquiry where I was thinking if we didn't have bad luck, we'd have no luck at all.
You didn't feel safe in the village?
Police were playing catch-up.
I can't think of another crime of this magnitude in the history of Northamptonshire Police.
In the beautiful Northampton countryside lies the quaint village of Wootton.
It's really lovely. Everyone knows everyone, so it's really chatty, really friendly. Yeah, it is nice, especially to have kids around here.
I love it. I know it's an old village. The church is very, very old, and we're in a conservation area, so people around here are very, very friendly. People have lived here for a long time. There are some families in the village who've been in the village a long, long time, so I think it says an awful lot. Very easygoing, yeah. Good community.
Wootton has a great community spirit. It has a lot of buildings, facilities, open space, considering it's an urban parish. There's the new building, Wootton Fields and Simpson Manor, and then there's the old village, which has got all its old traditional spirit with the church and the old village hall.
You've got the Yeoman of England pub in the village, Working Men's Club, you've got a community centre, they put on events, they do a food market every Saturday. Everyone helps each other out, everyone looks out for each other.
So Wootton was the perfect place for Jeff and Helen Ding, originally from East China, to raise their 2 daughters, Zing and Alice.
Jeff was a university lecturer up in Manchester, very educated man in the science field. Helen worked at the local school teaching languages. They had 2 daughters, Zing, also known as Nancy, and then they had a younger daughter, Alice, of whom Nancy was very protective.
Family life was busy, especially as Jeff split his week between home and his work at Manchester Metropolitan University.
I believe Jeff was a senior lecturer here, specialisms in polymers, so synthetic materials. His teaching was at first-year level. We all pride ourselves, giving support to our students, but Jeff really took that to a fantastic level. He spent most of his time with students, helping out with various problems that they might have with their studies, for instance. He was actually a hall warden in a halls of residence just on campus. I don't think I ever saw him once lose his temper or ever have any issues with staff. Very easy to get on with.
The Ding's eldest daughter, 18-year-old Zing, was an accomplished musician and preparing to go to university.
Zing came over as being very self-assured, very calm, very capable. She had a wicked sense of humour, and she was quite a live wire. But she managed to be friendly to everybody she met. She was good at everything. She was a remarkable student at school, and she'd already accepted a place at Nottingham University to study medicine.
Like her sister, 12-year-old Alice was also a keen musician.
Alice was quite bubbly. She had one of those smiles that would light up any room. A bit of a cheeky smile, but she was absolutely delightful. Very outgoing. You could tell she was the whole package as a violinist. I think both of the girls had a very strong work ethic, and no doubt that come down to them from their parents.
Both Jeff and Helen worked tirelessly to create a warm and inviting home for their daughters and their friends.
Really welcoming. You could literally turn up and they would invite you in for dinner. They were just such a good family. Like, you would want your kids to be friends with them because they were just the best.
They all seemed very happy and very settled. They loved that family home as well. That was a place they really liked to be. And it is a very nice neighbourhood, I have to say.
But this neighbourhood will never be the same after one fateful bank holiday in 2011.
It was a big holiday weekend. We'd had the royal wedding.
When William and Kate got married, the whole of the parish here was alive with street parties, Union flags everywhere, bunting, a lot of celebration. It was a super happy place.
I was actually working in the pub on the royal wedding. We opened early for it. Not many people actually came in because loads of people around the village were actually throwing street parties.
As the bank holiday weekend comes to a close, neighbours of the Ding family become concerned as they haven't been seen all weekend.
One of the family was due to attend something and they didn't turn up. And then the neighbour went round to see if they were okay and see where they were. The house was in relative darkness, no reply at the front door. That neighbour, thankfully, was a little bit persistent and went round to the back of the house.
Peering through the kitchen window, the neighbour glimpses what appears to be a body on the floor.
The police are alerted and clearly force entry to the premises.
As the officers enter the house, they discover not one, but 2 bodies.
Jeff is slumped by a radiator in the kitchen with multiple stab wounds. Helen is by the entrance door between the hall and the kitchen, and she's got multiple stab wounds.
The officers head upstairs and step into a harrowing scene.
Alice and Zing were up in the bedroom. The 2 girls are on the bed and they've both received a number of fatal stab wounds. You know, it was pretty horrendous.
With 4 members of the same family dead, detectives' first instinct is that the culprit could be amongst the deceased.
Nobody knows the reason that this family have ended up dead. One possible scenario is, and it does happen, is the murder-suicide aspect, where a family member has, for whatever reason, killed the other family members and then taken their own life.
With such a heavy police presence, rumours quickly spread across the village.
I remember working at the pub at the time and started hearing rumours, customers coming in saying something really bad had happened, but we were all still unsure of the extent of what had happened.
I first heard through a friend who I live near locally, whose daughter was very good friends with one of the young ladies. So it was horrific locally to everybody. The fact that the family had been there for a while and been not discovered was horrific, and a massive shock to the local community that something so awful could happen to such a lovely family. I wouldn't like to speculate on people's opinions, but to me personally, it felt a bit targeted.
Little did the villagers of Wootton know the scale of the crime that's been committed on their doorstep.
The murder of the Dean family was probably one of the most horrendous crimes I've ever been asked to investigate.
In the village of Wootton, police have discovered a family of 4 dead. Detective Superintendent Glyn Timmins is put in charge of the investigation.
I was at home on Sunday the 1st of May, enjoying the bank holiday weekend, and my colleague alerted me to the fact that he'd been called to the scene of potentially a multiple murder scene.
46-year-olds Jeff and Helen Ding and their 2 daughters, 18-year-old Zing and 12-year-old Alice, have all suffered fatal knife wounds.
I think what you're trying to do initially is you're trying to rationalise it in terms of what's a likely motive. Why would a family be murdered? You could be looking for a crazed, maniacal killer who's randomly struck at a household. You could be looking for aggravated burglars where it's gone horribly, horribly wrong. Are the family involved in some way with organised crime? Is this a contract killing because it's so brutal? You never stop searching your mind for options and potential and possibilities.
In Wootton, the heavy police presence has drawn in local reporter Daniel Owens.
It was around about 10 o'clock on the Sunday night when I first arrived on the scene. There was no information coming from the police. We couldn't speak to officers who were inside the house. All we were getting was the people outside guarding the scene, and they weren't telling us anything. I met a couple of lads down there who knew the family vaguely, and they seemed quite upset at what they'd heard. And there were theories doing the rounds that it was potentially a murder-suicide situation. When you have a man and a woman dead in the same house, one killed the other, turned the knife on himself, etc. And that was certainly something that we expected to be exploring.
But in a fast-moving investigation, it's quickly established that the culprit isn't likely to be one of the family.
Clearly, because of the violence that had been used, it was just obvious to the officers that this was an all-out slaughter of 4 people. The big demand at that stage is, well, there are 2. The first one is the preservation of the scene and to make sure that you extract and harvest every centimetre of forensic evidence that you can get hold of. And the other one is to start thinking about who's done this and why.
With a murderer in their midst, police are also aware that villagers could be at risk.
The overriding factor in terms of the community is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear that it might happen again, fear that there's a killer on the loose, that their homes and their loved ones and their families aren't safe.
Police held a press conference and details started to emerge, and we knew this was a story that we'd never seen the likes of before.
For villagers, the news turns what was a happy bank holiday to celebrate the marriage of Prince William and Kate into a tragic event on their own doorstep.
When everybody's enjoying a day, and it was a beautiful day, it's hard to believe that something so vicious can happen. We were just stunned, really stunned. You can't believe it, because you cannot understand, A, why anybody could do that to a family and to children. Yeah, it was a bit of a shock.
Well, I was walking to my grandparents and I saw there was a bit of commotion going on the street. I was about 2 streets away. So, yeah, it was very weird. I don't think I wanted to leave the house for a while. I think it made everyone a bit more cautious about what was going on.
People were very on edge. I mean, I wouldn't walk on my own anywhere. I think you didn't feel safe in the village anymore. You don't ever feel like something like that's ever going to happen in a little village.
I was absolutely devastated. I really could not get my head around it. It was a very, very sad day. Not just for me, but for all of my colleagues, for the whole community that we work in here.
As the community mourns, police need to establish exactly when the Ding family were killed.
The initial response is pretty much routine. You're starting to set up initial house-to-house inquiries, not structured formal ones, but sort of people knocking doors. Have you seen anything strange or suspicious? Has there been any screams, shouts, noises?
But the neighbours haven't seen or heard anything.
Effectively, we've got 4 people who've been slaughtered in their own home and very little else by way of information.
As each member of the family is examined, it's apparent that whoever was responsible carried out a frenzied attack.
The results of the post-mortem showed the true extent of the brutality involved. The family were subjected to a total of 51 stab wounds between them, with Jeff and his wife killed in the kitchen and the girls killed upstairs in their bedroom trying to hide from their killer.
In the house, a possible murder weapon is found. It's been cleaned and left on the kitchen worktop. And as police comb the scene for clues, they find a puzzling item in the Ding's letterbox. It's a calling card from West Midlands Police, and it's been left just hours before the bodies were discovered.
The visit took place on the Sunday morning, quite early on. Obviously, no reply at the front door, but it's early on a Sunday morning, not unreasonable for people to be in bed. It's a bank holiday weekend. The officers got no reply.
Why had the police visited the Ding's home early that morning? Who did they want to speak to? And was this in some way connected to their murders?
Someone I'd worked with previously was a detective superintendent in West Midlands. He rang me to say, was I aware of this missing persons inquiry?
Police had visited the Dings in relation to a missing persons inquiry, that of 52-year-old An Zhangdu.
An Zhangdu was a native of China and came over here in the late 90s with his wife, and he ran a herbal medicines business, which he ran with the Ding family for some time.
An Zhang had left his home on the bank holiday Friday, 2 days before his business partners, the Ding's bodies, were discovered.
An Zang Du left his wife at home watching the wedding while he boarded a train to Birmingham, where he went into his business premises.
He was going to open up the shop, albeit a bank holiday, albeit Kate and William's wedding. He'd gone in to do some work. When An Zang Du didn't return from work, his wife, she started to become concerned about him, where he might be, what state he was in.
It was totally out of character for him, and she was tearing her hair out with despair at where he was.
At some point later in that day, she reported him as a missing person to West Midlands Police.
An Zang's wife also described the night before he went missing and an unexpected knock at their door late at night.
Court officers turned up at An Zang Du's house and served court document. The ultimate outcome of the service of that court process would have resulted in bankruptcy for Mr. Du and his family. Mr. Du did not sleep that night. He was pacing up and down. He was clearly angry, agitated. It really had disturbed him.
The missing persons inquiry was raised on the Saturday, and as part of that investigation, police attended An Zang Du's business premises in Birmingham, where they found a note, effectively saying goodbye to his wife.
Leaving a note and with no contact for 4 days, police consider the possibility An Zang has taken his own life.
Clearly, you know, in terms of mindset, in terms of where he was at mentally at that stage, that would ring significant alarm bells for both, obviously, his wife and the police investigating his disappearance.
Police want to know, what was An Zang Du's fate? Could he also have been a victim of the Ding's killer?
What detectives were left pondering was whether the missing persons case was now linked to a quadruple murder.
But what detectives uncover next points not only to An Zang's fate, but also a motive for murder.
There was this legal dispute over business between the two families, and that there was a strong possibility that something had led to a coming together of Mr. Du on the one side and the Ding family on the other.
The quiet village of Wootton has been shocked by the mass murder of the Ding family. University lecturer Jeff, language teacher Helen, and their daughters Zing and Alice. All 4 have been found stabbed to death.
Wootton was not an area affected by crime, yet all of a sudden the world's media descended on their doorstep. It went from 0 to 60 in seconds.
I doubt anybody in the country had really heard about Wootton Parish. And suddenly it was all over the news, headline news. It was shocking that actually somebody had murdered somebody in our village, and it's suddenly all over the world. On the BBC, for want of a better word, suddenly Wootton is there. It's just bizarre.
It's just a normal village that people come to and live or work or whatever. It's just a normal village. When we heard what happened, how it happened, you can't believe it, because you cannot understand why anybody could do that to a family and to children. Yeah, it was a bit of a shock.
Police have linked another investigation to the Ding's murder, that of a missing persons inquiry for former business partner An Zang Du. He disappeared just days before the family of 4 were found, and it's been discovered that both families were at war.
An Zang Du and his wife had been involved in a bitter legal dispute with the Dings since 1999. It had been rumbling on for a long time. This relates to a breakdown in the business relationship.
This falling out resulted in a 10-year legal battle, which culminated in a late-night visit from lawyers.
Du and his wife had been served with a court injunction ordering them to repay £88,000, which forced them into a financial black hole and near bankruptcy.
This is a man that's completely at 6s and 7s. He's been knocked completely off his axis in terms of his future and what's going to happen to him.
Du clearly felt massively aggrieved. He'd put his life's work into this business and had it torn from underneath him, really.
That's when the bells start ringing and you've got the basis of a real solid motive for homicide.
Police believe An Zhang Du's anger at being summoned to pay the Dings an £88,000 settlement makes him a prime suspect. But they have yet to find any evidence which connects him to the crime.
What we would have to do is put Mr. Du at the scene of the murders.
All eyes turn to tracking An Zhang Du's movements on the day he went missing. He's first spotted on CCTV at his business in Birmingham.
He left the shop probably within 10 or 15 minutes of having arrived there.
He's next seen heading to a train station.
We traced him to New Street, so therefore we knew which train and platform he was on.
An Zhang Du then boards a train to Northampton.
There's CCTV footage of him on an escalator at Northampton bus station. So we know he transferred from the train station to the bus station. We then know that he got onto a bus that went to Wootton Village, and there is CCTV of An Zhang Du actually asking the driver of that bus for directions. Obviously, he was trying to establish where Jeff and Helen's house was in Pioneer Close.
So if you see down the road and you see the bus stop just down the road, that's where he came off the bus to come into the village. He got off and he came down this way, and I think went into the local store and asked for directions. So why would you think if somebody's asking you directions that there's anything the matter? You just think he's going to meet friends on that special day.
This represents a significant milestone in both inquiries. The person at the heart of the missing persons case, An Zhang Du, has been placed in the vicinity of the Dings family home on the day they were murdered.
So we're now putting him closer and closer to the scene, and subsequently we have the sighting of a gentleman of Chinese appearance stood outside the Ding family household, probably about 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 29th. So it's getting more and more and more likely that that person is An Zhang Du.
Now a prime suspect in the murder of a family of 4, police need to find out where he went next. But then the trail goes cold. An Zhang Du isn't seen on CCTV either leaving the area on foot or by bus.
There was an understandable level of fear among neighbours. 4 of their friends, including 2 young children, had been killed, and the person responsible hadn't been apprehended. He was on the loose. Where was he? Would he return? Would he do it again?
With days since the murders took place and no idea where the suspect could be, detectives examine every possible angle.
He's already got a 2-day head start on us. What we discovered in house-to-house routine inquiries is that the Ding family, their family car had gone in for service, and as a result they'd been given a hire car or a courtesy car to run around in, and that car was not at the Ding family household.
Police were now able to issue a name and a picture of their main suspect with a warning not to approach him in any circumstances. They revealed the car he was driving, and the country was put on alert to help find this man who was wanted in connection with 4 brutal murders.
The manhunt for An Zhang Du puts all forces across the UK on alert.
Police investigating the murders of a family of 4 in the village of Wootton, Northampton, have released information on a man wanted for questioning. 52-year-old Chinese national An Zhang Du was last seen 4 days ago, driving a silver Vauxhall Corsa. Members of the public are being advised not to approach him.
The pressure's immense, and it's a responsibility not just on your own professional reputation, but, you know, there's a community out there who expects the police to capture somebody who's this dangerous.
Key to tracking An Zhang Du is using automatic number plate recognition cameras.
We were hoping that modern technology such as ANPR, which is a very, very standard form of police inquiry, would help us out in that situation.
After multiple inquiries, a lead comes in. The stolen car's number plate triggered a camera on the night of the murders at a service station just outside Northampton on the M1.
And it showed that that vehicle, that hire vehicle, had been there at about 9:45 on the evening of the 29th. And Ang Zhang-du had been in to buy some chocolate or a drink, and importantly, a map book.
But where Ang Zhang is going, detectives don't know. ANPR cameras are checked, and there's no sign of the stolen car on any road in the UK. Ang Zhang-du has vanished.
At this point, police had no idea of Ang Zhang-du's whereabouts. Was he dead? Was he alive? Was he even in the UK?
While the manhunt intensifies, the Ding's friends and family are trying to come to terms with what's happened.
There was great sorrow from the students, especially those who were close to him doing projects and so on with him. A great sense of shock and sorrow that someone that helped them so much, of course, now was no longer with us.
For Zing and Alice's friends, meeting at their first county orchestral practice is a traumatic time.
It affected many of the other students very deeply. At orchestral rehearsals in the following week, flowers were left on their chairs. You know, teaching is one thing, but no one can prepare you for... How does a teacher cope with this? I don't know. No one prepares you for that.
For Jeff's family, struggling with the loss is only compounded by the grief of not knowing why this happened.
Actually, I first learned from the internet news, and I was completely shocked. I even cannot finish the news. Okay, once I saw the picture, I just, I cannot believe there's 4 members all gone. It's just complete shock. Okay, and then I think about my parents. If I cannot, I manage that, think about the parents. They lost their children, their grandchildren, only one day.
Police investigating the murders of a family of 4 from Northampton have said they are concentrating their inquiries in London after a car stolen from the property was found parked near the Edgware Road.
After weeks of searching, the police get their first lead on their hunt for Ang Zhang-du, and it's created major problems for the investigation.
Unfortunately for us, Mr. Du, in his stolen hire car, managed to get all the way to St John's Wood in London without triggering a single police ANPR system. There was a point in this inquiry I was thinking if we didn't have bad luck, we'd have no luck at all. Because not only did he miss ANPR, but when that car's parked in a side street in St John's Wood, the car is ticketed 9 times in 11 days. So we're now 13 days behind that. That's a significant problem in an investigation, because if you can go more or less anywhere in the world in 2 days, the world is literally your oyster in 13.
Whilst Du could be anywhere in the world, police concentrate their search in London.
Anyone who's been to London knows how easy it is to become anonymous in a city of that size and what opportunities there are to disappear within various communities. Obviously, that was a huge concern to us, because if Ang Zhang-du wanted to lie low, then there's no finer place for him to do that and become anonymous and not be troubled too much. We're back to needle in a haystack time.
House-to-house inquiries uncover CCTV footage of Ang Zhang-du abandoning his stolen car in the early hours of the Friday night. Which reinforces detective suspicions that he's still in the area. The investigation moves to Chinatown in London's West End, and officers hand out wanted posters.
Obviously, language is an issue, although clearly most of the Chinese community within those areas will speak English. I think the most difficult cultural barrier is a natural reluctance to become involved with the police. And some people, even thought it was bad luck to put posters in shop windows and things like that. So, you've got to overcome those, but all you can do is reach out and engage and try and gain their confidence, but it certainly doesn't make it easier.
Whilst he's made it to London, police intel suggests that Ang Sang Do wouldn't have gone far.
He was described to us as somebody innocuous, someone who probably would struggle to find his way round of his own volition,
Little did police know just how wrong this intel would prove to be.
Du had made his way through France and Spain and had been seen getting on a ferry from Tangier to Morocco. He'd also been stopped at a border in Algeria. With multiple sightings, this had now become an international manhunt.
Police hunting for a man suspected of murdering a family of 4 from Wootton Village in Northamptonshire have put out a reward of £25,000 for information which could lead to his arrest. Detectives say there have been over 380 sightings of Ang Sang Do across Europe, but the 52-year-old has now been missing for almost a year.
Having reviewed over 5,000 hours of CCTV footage and interviewing over 2,000 people, police have discovered that Ang Sang Do is no longer in the country.
It's a mind-blowing thought because literally there are 6 billion people in this world. Where do we start? Which country do we start with? You're just thinking, oh my goodness, where do we go from here?
I doubt anybody in the country had really heard about Wootton Parish. And suddenly it was all over the news, headline news. This guy had come into our parish, he'd committed these dreadful murders, and then he was running off around the world where they couldn't find him. It put Wootton for a while in the news.
It was strange having Wootton put out there like that.
Through CCTV analysis, police have uncovered Ang Sang Do's journey from Wootton to London and then onwards.
He took a coach to the coast and then over to Paris, then onwards to a Spanish port. And the long and short of it is, by the time the police became aware of the bodies, he was out of the country. He's gone.
The police reach out to forces around the world and decide to travel to Spain.
Detectives had issued an appeal on the Spanish version of Crime Watch, and that appeal went out far and wide across the country.
That broadcast was seen also in Morocco, and my understanding is that as a result of that, a supervisor or foreman on the building site where Ang Sang Do had been working as a labourer, he alerted the local authorities, and the local authorities arrested Ang Sang Do after something like 14 months of being on the run.
Yeah, I remember when they caught him, I remember thinking, how on earth did he get there? Unnoticed and working, actually. How is he working? It shows they don't have the same laws that we have here about working. But yes, it was great. It was a good feeling to know he'd been caught.
I remember when the news broke out that he was being extradited back to the UK to be charged for the murders. Everyone felt like justice was finally going to be done.
But even though Ang Sang Do is safely locked up in a Moroccan jail, it's another 6 months before he's returned to the UK and charged with 4 counts of murder. It's taken over 2 years, but the trial into the murders of 4 members of the Ding family begins at Northampton Crown Court.
Surprisingly, Du pleaded not guilty in the court case. His version of events was that he'd gone round there to simply talk to the Du family and things had spiralled out of control.
The issue for this trial was not so much whether he killed the Ding family, it's whether he did it as a murderer of sound mind or whether there was some kind of diminished element.
The court hears how on the 29th of April 2011, Ang Zhang-du was furious after he received a court order after a lengthy legal battle with Jeff and Helen Ding. His assets were frozen and he was ordered to pay the Dings £88,000. So, while the nation watched William and Kate get married, Ang Zhang-du had gone to his shop to pick up a kitchen knife. Then, he headed towards the village where the Ding family lived.
My belief is that when he left the New Street station just after 11, he was going to Wootton in Northamptonshire with one thing on his mind, and that thing was murder, the ultimate revenge.
Ang Zhang-du admits he entered the Ding's house via the back gate and finds Jeff Ding in the kitchen. They argue, and he stabs Jeff multiple times before attacking his wife Helen. He then goes upstairs and kills Zing and Alice. They are both huddled together in one bedroom.
What I can't reconcile, what I'll never be able to understand, is when that anger, that evilness, that bile is such that it makes a grown man climb a set of stairs, enter a room with two young girls cowering on a bed, frightened beyond description, and then plunge a knife into both of them and fatally wound them both without any compunction or restriction, just to execute two young. I'll never get over it. I'll never understand it.
During the trial, the jury also hears a recording of a 999 call. It was made by one of the girls when they heard Ang Zhang-du attacking their parents.
It transpired that a 999 call had been made from the property at the time of the killings. Police had responded to the call, but had been sent to the wrong address and had no answer, and therefore the case was effectively closed.
I've heard that tape recording. It's horrific. Absolutely horrific. And those screams, I won't forget them, because I know what was happening when those girls were screaming, because a murderer had entered the room and was in the process of fatally murdering those two girls. Absolutely. I can't reconcile myself to that action. It's horrendous.
As the trial progresses, further details emerge about what happened after Du murdered the family.
After killing the family of four, Du stayed in the house for 6 hours and actually went to sleep.
He then takes the time to wash the kitchen knife that he brought with him and leaves it on the kitchen worktop before stealing money and the Ding's hire car. He manages to evade authorities for over a year. But after a 2-week trial, Ang Zhang-du is found guilty of all 4 counts of murder.
Ang Zhang-du was found guilty of multiple murders and was sentenced to 40 years in prison, the longest sentence ever passed down in the history of courts in Northamptonshire.
With all due respect, Ang Zhang-du is exactly where he should be in terms of the crime he committed and public safety.
The community were pleased that something so barbaric had gone full circle, really, and the man who had carried out this dreadful crime had been put away.
The fact that he's never going to get out of prison, yeah, but it still should never have happened. But they've got as much justice as possible.
After 10 years, those that knew the family are still coming to terms with the loss.
I don't think there's ever any way that justice can ever really be done that can make up, really, for what happened. There isn't. And that's the closest we can get. Whatever punishment, he got is never going to make up for what happened that day.
I suppose there was some sense of, OK, that's over now. But you're never going to get those girls back, ever. And that's going to remain with me for the rest of my life.
Aung San Suu Kyi will be 92 years old before he's eligible for release. But for Jeff's brother, Ji Xiang, life will never be the same.
I cannot accept, the reality, basically. And then I think about my parents. They lost their children, their grandchildren, on one day. I have many questions to ask him. Among them, the only one question that strikes me most is, I want to ask him, how could you stab a knife into an innocent girl's heart? Not once, but twice. How could you do that? An innocent girl, you get that in. I'm not that confident whether I can rebuild my life anymore. I don't think my life will be the same again as before.
It looked as if the body had been dropped from the sky.
I could hear my mum screaming, and by then I just knew.
It just wasn't right, so it fills you with a cold dread.
So here we are coming to the stage where the serial killer effect kicked in.
Early in the morning of the 28th of August 1981, a commuter discovered the mutilated body of a young girl dumped by the Thames in Windsor. Unable to pinpoint exactly where she'd been killed meant that finding the killer was like looking for a needle in a haystack. All the police knew for certain was that they were looking for a violent and sadistic individual who took pleasure in inflicting pain, and that he was likely to do it again. Built on the banks of the River Thames in Berkshire is the town of Windsor. It's home to Windsor Castle, which has been an official residence of the British royal family for almost 1,000 years.
Windsor is a very, very busy town, very busy tourist town. However, the village of Windsor, the residence area of Windsor, is very local, just like any other village, and everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows everybody else's business.
On a bright, sunny Friday morning in August 1981, Kenneth Linney of Thames Valley Police received a phone call, starting a case that would become a 30-year personal crusade.
I was at home and I received a call about 6:30 in the morning to say that a body had been found on the banks of the Thames in Windsor. I immediately attended.
When Detective Superintendent Linney reached the scene at 6:45, he was met by a horrific sight.
I arrived at Barry Avenue, where the body was in a face-down position, naked, that of a teenage girl, and it transpired that it was found by a man on his way to work. He immediately notified the police. I then made various phone calls and got other officers out to form an inquiry team and the uniformed officers to seal the area off. And from there it went on into a general investigation.
There's no attempt to conceal the body, in fact, far from it. And one can only speculate as to the significance of this, but it could be that leaving the body in that condition to full public view might have been an additional twist to the humiliation of the victim.
Houseboats moored just meters from the body were immediately investigated.
All those boats were stopped from moving, and officers then started interviewing the occupants to see if they'd heard anything during the night.
By 7 a.m. they had ascertained that no one had heard anything, and Detective Superintendent Linney continued organising the investigation.
I notified then the Home Office pathologist. I then formulated a small incident room at Windsor Police Station until we had identified the body. It was very important to find out who this girl was. No girl had been reported missing in the Windsor area.
Almost 13 miles away near Hanwell in West London, mother of 3 Carol Walterson made a worrying discovery about her 17-year-old daughter Claire.
Went to wake her up and she wasn't in her bed, and it just wasn't right, so it fills you with a cold dread.
A worried Carol went to work, whilst in Windsor the police investigation continued.
It looked as if the body had been dropped from the sky due to the fact there was no blood or anything outside the basic body area. And bear in mind that there were severe wounds to the body. This was a problem for us. But we could find no forensic evidence as to where it was dropped from.
The forensic team then went about doing a procedure called taping.
Taping is done with sellotape to take any particles off the body. It's laid out then and sealed and used later on then for forensic report purposes.
In the early 80s, forensic scientists could only compare and match fibre samples. So until they found a comparison, the tapings were sent for storage. Then a preliminary investigation was carried out by the pathologist at the scene.
The wounds that were on the body could have been done in situ, where the body was found. But the body was definitely unconscious, if not lifeless, when it was laid on the footpath.
The pathologist found that Claire's throat had been cut and she'd been sadistically mutilated. It was too much, even for the most experienced of officers.
The injuries caused to the girl, horrific injuries that were caused to her, and how she must have suffered. And I think it affects you. I have 4 daughters, and I could see my teenage daughters in the same situation. So it does affect you.
It wasn't long before this horrendous and baffling murder made the national news.
I went to work and heard on the radio that they'd found somebody, her body, and I just knew it was her. I just knew it was her from where they found her in Windsor, which wasn't far from us. I don't know why, I just knew it was her, so I went into a complete panic. I phoned all the friends that I knew to see whether she was there. I phoned her work, and they were very cross that she just hadn't turned up. So I got home and went straight to the police station.
Once Claire had been reported missing, police quickly made the potential link.
The Metropolitan Police rang to say that a girl was missing from the Hanwell area. So we've notified them again, and officers came down and they identified the body.
Certain they had the right person, it was time for the police to tell the family and confirm Carol's worst fears.
Yes, it was her. After they looked at photos and things. And I can't even begin to describe what it was like after that.
Claire's older brother Nick arrived home, hoping his sister was still just missing.
After I heard it on the radio and everything else, and I made my way home, and that, as I was walking down the pavement, I could hear my mum screaming indoors. I could hear her screaming, and by then I just knew as well. And I think it was the police or someone that answered the door, and I think I just turned and said, "Is it?" or something, and they said, "Yeah."
Thames Valley police officers wasted no time looking into Claire's background.
I went up with another officer to Yedding Lane, to the family home, and there spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. They, of course, were in a terrible state, and I then again got officers to sit with them and left them to mourn their fate. It was a terrible shock, because the girl was used to going out during the day, and she was a local girl, and was well liked by everybody in the district.
On a council estate, there wasn't too much to do, but you have lots of friends, so she was always with friends, and, well, we always had a house full of friends. I think that was more her enjoyment. And also when she got her job, that became the be-all and end-all of her life, because she loved it so much and obviously loved the people there as well.
The next morning, the sun may have risen as usual, but for Claire's mum, Carol, the world as she knew it had ended.
All I can really remember is the house being full of policemen. It was just basically showing photos, and so really then we were dealing with it the next day when we knew it really was her, and been dealing with it ever since.
Whilst the family began a lifetime of grieving, the police continued with their investigation, determined to find Claire's vicious killer.
It was decided that an incident room, a major incident room, should be set up in the Metropolitan Police District.
Pete Byrne was a young policeman at that time.
I was involved in the investigation, in that I was a young detective and was part of the 50-strong team of detectives that worked on the investigation.
The police's first job was to build up a picture of Claire and her final movements on that fateful Thursday night.
Claire was ironing, and we said, "Are you going out tonight?" And she said, "No."
Me and Claire was just sitting in the kitchen having a chat, which was unusual really. We was having a good old chat and everything, and she weren't going out that night. And that, you know. But the funny thing was, I remember, God, we must be growing up because of the way we was talking to each other. But I don't know, she was staying in and that was it.
But when we got home, she had gone out. She was 17, it wasn't a problem. But she was always in by 10 o'clock or abouts. But I thought 17, okay, it's 11 o'clock, you know. It's always the first time. But then when she didn't come home, couldn't sleep at all, because it just wasn't like her. She'd never been away all night unless we'd known about it. But then I heard laughing outside, and I thought, oh, she's home. So I went off to sleep.
It didn't take long for police to piece together Claire's last night.
On the Thursday evening, Claire had gone to see her boyfriend, who ran an amusement arcade on the Uxbridge Road at Ealing. She had left there around about 10 p.m. Normally, he would have given her a lift home, but they had a slight disagreement, and she refused a lift. So she walked along the Uxbridge Road in the direction of her home in Northolt. Her boyfriend did attempt to get her into the car, stopped, asked her to get into the car, but she refused. That sighting of Claire being spoken to by her boyfriend is the last known sighting of Claire alive.
The boyfriend was immediately treated as a suspect.
He said he went home then by 10:30 that night, but he was arrested on suspicion of murder.
Even though the police had been left with no clues, could they have already managed to find the murderer? In August 1981, 17-year-old Claire Walterton had been horrifically murdered and dumped in Windsor, and so far, no forensic evidence had been found. Police had quickly pieced together Claire's final movements, identifying the last person she was seen with, who was arrested for murder and questioned.
Inquiries in relation to his whereabouts later on that evening revealed that he had gone home and was seen by a neighbour walking a dog shortly afterwards, so therefore he was ruled out as being the potential attacker of Claire.
With their only suspect now eliminated, the police looked at using the power of publicity.
There was a lot of media activity, television and all, up at Hanwell. And of course the papers then had the large columns on it.
Information about Claire's last night was released by police to the press.
2 ladies came forward following publicity and said that they'd seen a girl dragged into a car at the junction of Uxbridge and Yedding Lane about roughly around the time that Claire was last seen. They couldn't give any descriptions. All they could say was a dark-coloured car.
Keen to get the most from their only lead, police weren't afraid to try experimental techniques.
I resorted to hypnotists actually interviewing some of these people, because we felt that if you can probably refresh someone's memory by that means, then, of course, we may come up with something that the person doesn't think of normally.
Hypnotism didn't seem to have the desired effect.
Whether that person that the lady saw was Claire is unknown. A large part of the initial investigation centred on trying to identify that vehicle, but it was never traced.
The ladies were so vague about this. They thought a girl was pulled into a car. There was no screams, nothing whatsoever. And it was some distance away, they saw it. So there was no evidential value, really, in that particular incident.
Disappointed but undeterred, the investigation team continued with their inquiries.
The incident room then, once we established it at Norwood Green, became a very busy place, because we had to do a lot of house-to-house inquiries from Hanwell down the Uxbridge Road right up to the top of Yedding Lane, which would have covered at the area where she would have walked. Then other inquiries had to be dealt with. You had inquiries, national inquiries, you had inquiries dealing with people with previous convictions for that type of offence or for sexual offences. So there was a lot of work to be done and a lot of foot slogging, to put it plainly.
For some on the team, this was all a new experience.
It was my first ever murder, and I was just learning how things are done on a major investigation in terms of the system. There was no computer as such, so everything was paper-based, but everything had to be done in a clear and methodical way so that nothing was missed.
There was a huge amount of work to be done.
The police inquiries, the witnesses, the incident room sometimes picks out something which is unusual from statements or movements or a person, the background of a person. And they have to be followed up, and they're known as actions. Actions are then dealt with by the detective officers who are out on the ground. It takes a long time. The average working hours during the day on an inquiry like that can be anything from 12 to 14 hours a day. It's a lot of work.
After months of fruitlessly investigating every possible avenue, police were getting desperate.
Clairvoyants came forward. So many people came forward because it was a nasty murder. And the press gave it a lot of publicity.
With nothing to lose, a clairvoyant was introduced to Carol and the family.
She got in touch with them and they were clutching at straws. And she stayed for a couple of hours. But she kept saying things that Claire would have said, but Claire would never have spoken the way she was speaking, and she kept making out she was talking to her, which I found so upsetting, because if Claire was going to talk to anybody, she would have talked to me. Sorry. So, yeah, I had to ask her if she would go in the end, because she'd really overstayed her welcome.
In the spring of 1982, over 6 months after Claire Walterton's mutilated body was discovered in Windsor, the police still didn't have a single lead.
We tried everything, and with the result, of course, we didn't get anywhere. We had all our exhibits. They were put in storage in 1982. And then, as I say, I thought at that stage that we'll never solve the case unless, because of the sadistic injuries that were caused, were we dealing with a serial killer.
It was a horrible thought. Claire's killer probably wouldn't be caught unless they killed again.
This was someone who was really, really sadistic. And that was the type of person we were looking for.
The mutilation, the clearly sexual nature of the crime, suggests that there's a distinct possibility that the individual would strike again.
The failure to track down Claire's murderer was a big blow for everyone concerned.
You have to remember what things were like back in 1981. DNA as an investigative tool didn't exist. There was no CCTV. Mobile phones were very, very rare, and automatic number plate recognition didn't exist. However, you can only do what you can do, and if all the normal lines of inquiry haven't produced anything, then unfortunately you have to be pragmatic, and the investigation is wound down.
Well, it's disappointing that you like to get a result. You think of the girl lying on the pavement in Windsor, and it affects you. I don't care how hard anybody is, but it affects you. And it affected other officers at the time.
The chilling thought that Claire's killer would strike again never left the officers involved in the case. And in December 1984, Detective Superintendent Linney received the news he'd been expecting for over 2 years.
I had a phone call from officers over at Denham to say that they had found a body on the golf course. They told me that the body that they had was of a girl, naked and with horrific injuries. Now, I thought, well, this is identical. The modus operandi kicked in. The modus operandi is the method used by criminals, the same method that is used. And that is the base of serial killers. So here we are coming to the stage where the serial killer effect kicked in.
Now investigating 2 similar killings, Thames Valley Police were forced to wonder, had Claire's murderer struck again? Just over 3 years after the unsolved murder of Claire Walterton in Windsor, a mutilated body of a woman called Deirdre Sainsbury was found dumped at a golf course in Denham. It was a discovery that grabbed the police's attention. The body found on the golf course had chilling similarities to the murder of Claire Walterton.
As soon as I heard of this incident and the fact that it was identical more or less to the girl that was found in Windsor, Claire Woolton's name, of course, was there, printed all over it.
A murder investigation was immediately launched.
The police publicised the fact of the murder, and by chance, a man had seen Deirdre get into a vehicle on the South Circular Road in Richmond. That man had only recently read an article in the Reader's Digest which talked about the dangers of hitchhikers, and he had the presence of mind to recall the index number or registration number of the car that this hitchhiker had got into.
It was a huge piece of luck.
Police from the Denham inquiry, having received the registered owner of the vehicle, went to the house of Colin Campbell, who was the registered owner. They searched his property and found in the garage the clothing from the girl found on the golf course at Denham.
Police arrested and interviewed 37-year-old travelling salesman and keen amateur hockey player, Colin Campbell.
He admitted picking Deirdre up, stated that he chatted to her en route. In doing so, he gave his name, or his first name, and he felt, as he was getting on so well with her, he would try it on. He did. According to him, she retaliated and hit him, and then he hit her. But he stated he hit her so hard that she became unconscious. He stated he then panicked because he'd given his name to her, and in a panic, he then hit her about the head with a hockey stick, which is in the back of his car.
Campbell also admitted mutilating the body, allegedly to make it look like a maniac had done it. Convinced that there was a strong connection between Deirdre and Claire's killings, Detective Superintendent Linney went to see Campbell, hoping he might also confess to Claire's murder.
He was absolutely so suave, so complete, answered everything that I asked. Windsor? Oh yes, he'd been to Windsor. He'd been everywhere that I mentioned. But I had nothing whatsoever at that stage to connect him with Claire's murder. Nothing had been found at his property. And so I was left as I was in the beginning. And which was rather sad actually, because I thought that he might just break, but no.
It was disappointing, but the investigation into the brutal murder of Deirdre Sainsbury moved quickly.
Having been interviewed, admitted being responsible for Deirdre's death, he was charged with the murder and stood trial at Reading Crown Court. His plea in court was not guilty to murder. He stated that whilst responsible for Deirdre's death, he killed her whilst suffering an epileptic episode.
The jury chose not to believe an epileptic episode could explain this brutal and sexually motivated killing. In July 1985, just 6 months after her death, Campbell was convicted of Deirdre Sainsbury's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. But Detective Superintendent Linney wasn't satisfied.
It was too much of a coincidence that we had the modus operandi of a man who was sadistic when he dealt with Deirdre Sainsbury, and the same man, in my opinion, committed the murder of Claire Woolton. I had to sit back and just wait and wait, because I felt this. He might talk later on. This happens. They sometimes do, if there's something on their mind.
Unaware of Kenneth Linney's theory, as the years went by, Claire's family tried to cope with the huge void that had been left in their lives.
I think about it all the time. Always remember birthdays. Christmases is very difficult because she was Christmas. Holidays were difficult In fact, you spend a lot of time thinking that you shouldn't be doing holidays, Christmas and things like that, because it didn't feel right without her being there.
For me, Claire was Claire. I can't explain to you how that is. Claire was just a happy-go-lucky Claire.
Most memories I have are quite normal memories, because having a meal was just never having a meal. It was always laughing, having a meal at something that she'd either done or was doing while you were having the meal. So mostly, when we sit down for dinner, I often remember some of the silly things she did. You know, she would either have peas up her nose or ice cream all over her face, or she would fill her mouth up with food and then laugh with her mouth open. It sounds awful, but when you're having a meal, it's actually quite funny.
Well, with my brother, it really affected him badly. He had a nervous breakdown and everything. So in the end, I didn't just lose a sister, I lost half of a brother as well, because he just weren't the same ever since.
In 1996, 15 years after his conviction for murdering Deirdre Sainsbury, Colin Campbell appealed.
He stated that whilst he was guilty of causing her death, it wasn't murder.
At the appeal, he put forward the same defence as his original trial, but this time with the backing of an expert, who stated that due to being on the wrong medication, an epileptic episode could have been to blame. Campbell's conviction was quashed, and in 1999, a retrial ordered.
At that retrial, Campbell proffered a plea to manslaughter, which was accepted by the Crown, and he was therefore convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment again, but with a minimum tariff of 1 day.
The presiding judge, Mr. Justice Gage, said that whilst the court accepted that at the time of the killing Campbell's responsibility had been diminished, he still constituted a danger to the public, so couldn't be released without going through a parole hearing. It wasn't the result he'd hoped for.
And at subsequent hearings before the parole board, it was deemed that he was too dangerous to be released.
As the years went by, Campbell remained in prison, but the unsolved murder of Claire Walterton was never forgotten.
We didn't close the case completely, of course. You never do. We carried on taking inquiries and questions and answers from people, for other forces ringing up. This often happens, and you compare notes.
Police remained determined that they would bring Claire's murderer to justice. By 2011, the depraved murderer of Claire Walterton still hadn't been found, although police did have their suspicions about Colin Campbell, who was in prison for the strikingly similar 1984 killing of Deirdre Sainsbury. In 2007, Thames Valley Police had started looking at cold cases headed up by Pete Byrne. Claire's case was about to turn a corner.
In 2011, we had the capacity to commence a reinvestigation and a review into Claire's case. What we were looking to do was to use advancements in forensic science in the intervening 30 years to see if we could potentially identify the person responsible for her death.
What the review team found was to be key in moving the case forward.
One of the items that we submitted for additional forensic work was the tapings. These tapings had been originally taken to potentially obtain fibres. However, we knew from other cases that had been investigated by other forces within the UK that now you could get DNA that had been captured from those tapings.
The evidence was sent to LGC Forensics near Oxford for DNA analysis.
Tapes were examined microscopically and small sections were cut out and submitted for DNA profiling.
Pete Byrne contacted Kenneth Linney, who had retired, to tell him a cold case review was taking place.
Which I was delighted about, because I thought something might happen or come from that.
It didn't take long for the lab to come back with a result.
A mixed DNA profile was obtained which appeared to be from Claire Waterton and from an unknown male. We used that profile of the unknown male to search the National DNA Database, and this identified a list of potential contributors. Colin Campbell was amongst those individuals.
It was a name that was well known to everyone involved in the original 1981 case.
The moment I saw his name, I knew that he was a convicted killer. So I was obviously really, really excited.
The match to Campbell was strong, but it wasn't strong enough to guarantee a conviction.
At that point, they were able to say it was a 1 in a million match probability. Whilst that's good, normally for DNA, it's a 1 in a billion match probability.
A 1 in a million match probability meant that there could be up to 60 other individuals in the country who the DNA could belong to. 1 in a billion would mean it almost certainly came from Campbell.
So we needed additional forensic work to take place, which involved using a professor of genetic statistics from UCL College in London. That was going to take time, and also we were doing additional tests on other tapings that had been recovered from Claire's body.
In 2011, having been in prison for 26 years, Campbell was coming to the end of his sentence for what was now the manslaughter of Deirdre Sainsbury.
Campbell was a Category D prisoner, which meant he was allowed access out into the open, and obviously it was a potential danger to members of the public, the fact that this man potentially now was a double killer. So we had to make contact with the prison service, get him recategorised so that he was sent back to a closed prison.
Finally, after months of waiting, there was news from UCL College in London.
We had work completed by this professor of genetics who was able to say that the match probability, in his opinion, was 1 in a billion of Colin Campbell being the donor of the DNA found on the tapings.
The news meant that Kenneth Linney's original hunch in 1984 about Campbell had been right.
When I found out that Colin Campbell had been identified through DNA as being identical to a person's hair, his hair, which had been found on the tape taken at our mortuary, I was delighted.
On November the 27th, 2012, 31 years after Claire was killed, Colin Campbell was arrested. Police decided to question him.
Campbell showed no remorse whatsoever, and I got the impression that he felt that he was a victim, in as much that he had epilepsy, it had been wrongly diagnosed, he'd been given the wrong medication years ago, and it's other people's fault.
My lifestyle meant that the way I was, I wasn't averse to being friendly with the lady.
Yeah.
I may well have known a series of ladies.
Okay.
Claire may have been one of them. No, I don't. She looks like any girl I may have played hockey with. She looks like any girl I may have met through work.
Okay.
Actually, she looks like a happy person, and I'm glad about that. No, I don't recognise her.
Okay, thank you very much.
That's not to say I never ever knew her. I just don't remember her.
To my mind, had you committed that horrendous act against Claire, you would have known what you'd done and you'd remember it. But he was almost blasé about the fact, well, I can't remember what I was doing. We consulted with the Crown Prosecution Service. They agreed that Campbell should be charged. He was charged.
Once Campbell was charged, it was time to inform Claire's family.
Somebody described it as like a fresh scab that had been picked off. It was like an old wound that had been reopened, and that described it quite well for me.
On the 15th of November 2013, Colin Frederick Campbell stood trial at Reading Crown Court for the 1981 murder of Claire Walterton. Claire's mum, Carol, was there from the start.
It was very, very, very hard and very emotional and very upsetting.
Colin Campbell entered a plea of not guilty.
Campbell couldn't run the defence that the epilepsy was the cause of his actions which resulted in Claire's death. That was because the experts had given evidence for him in relation to Deirdre's death weren't happy to say that epilepsy could be responsible for 2 homicides.
Claire's mum, Carol, had her own way of dealing with the grisly details of the case.
I didn't stay in for all the nasty bits at all. But what I was in there for was quite difficult.
Claire's family had tremendous courage. Claire's mum wanted to come to court. She wanted to make sure that the man responsible for her daughter's death was convicted. But at the same time, and rightly so, she didn't want to know the full details of what happened to her daughter.
The prosecution called on their trump card, the DNA.
The key item was the DNA evidence. That's what brought the case to court in the first place. And when a DNA expert tells a jury this DNA is 1 billion times more likely to belong to Colin Campbell than anyone else, I think that was the key bit of information.
Faced with such compelling DNA evidence, Campbell put up his own defence.
He couldn't recall ever going into the amusement arcade where Claire had been that evening, but said he may have got in there, and had he gone in there, he may well have spoken to her, and he may well have touched her, and that's how his DNA got on her body. What was interesting was that the taping that from where the DNA was obtained was marked as being taken from Claire's buttocks, so therefore the fact that he was potentially saying it was innocent contact made that extremely unlikely.
The defence were, if I recall, trying to sort of blur the lines a little bit and discredit the DNA. But I think when you say it's 1 billion times, that's pretty damning.
At the beginning of December 2013, the judge sent the jury out to deliberate.
The jury took quite a long time for it to come out, to make up their mind, which was just a nightmare again. You don't realise how much that is chewing you up inside and how much tensed you are. And that.
After 3 excruciating days, the jury came back, and Campbell was convicted of murder. A few days later, the sentence followed. The judge, Mr. Justice Spencer, stated that only Campbell would know the true circumstances in which he came to pick up Claire Walterton that Thursday night in 1981, but that he was certain he did it with the intention of sexually assaulting, mutilating, and ultimately killing her.
Colin Campbell was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Claire Walterton. He must serve a minimum of 24 years. By that time, he'll be 90 years of age.
For Claire's family, it was a bittersweet moment.
I started to get fed up with people going, oh, now you'll have closure. Because you don't have closure. If she's still gone. She still went through something that was horrible. I mean, I really do say I am really pleased that they got him, but having it all raked up again was really difficult.
What he got and everything else weren't even long enough, as far as I'm concerned.
He took a beautiful life away. A beautiful life. Somebody who was just coming into being a girl, a woman. And that's just not fair. It's not fair.
Kenneth Linney, who had been involved from the very beginning, was there to hear it all.
The judge, of course, made it quite clear to him when he sentenced him that he wasn't going to get away with the epilepsy excuse that he gave before. They couldn't produce any witnesses to say that it was epilepsy. And the judge made a comment that if the Court of Appeal had known his background, he mightn't have had his sentence squashed. And it was nice to know that he was convicted and rightly sentenced to a long term. He will never be released from prison.
Although former Detective Superintendent Linney wasn't the only officer with a vested interest in the outcome.
Since 1981, Claire's case has been at the forefront of everyone's mind that worked on that case. When I got my current job, when I met old detectives that worked on Claire's case, they always asked me, what's happening with Claire's case? They were all extremely pleased when we got the result and Campbell was convicted. So much so that they held a reunion 6 months after the trial where they just wanted to meet up, talk about the case and just say well done, because it was all part of their life.
After 32 years of trying to solve this brutal and bewildering case, Kenneth Linney could be satisfied they'd got the right man.
Many more people would he have killed had he got away with the Denham case. Because if you get someone who starts that activity of killing young girls and causing horrific injuries on them, when do they stop? That's the question. And I believe that we did stop the makings of a serial killer.
Campbell was in his late 60s at the time of his conviction for Claire's brutal murder, which means it was unlikely he'd ever be released. Finally, Claire and Deirdre's families could feel that justice had been done.
The scenery is stunning, but the lies are getting uglier. Reese Witherspoon, Nicole Kidman and Laura Dern lead an all-star cast. Big Little Lies is new Friday at 9 on Sky Mix.
I was thinking, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
I was shielded from the raw details.
It did change the village at the time.
As a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
On the morning of the 30th of October 1966, a discovery was made that was to plunge the village of Beenham into a nightmare that its inhabitants would have to live with for nearly half a century. The village of Beenham in Berkshire is only 51 miles from London, but in 1966, this rural community may as well have been 1 million miles away.
Back in the 60s, we all knew each other. It was more tight-knit than it is now. It's still a very close village and everyone knows each other and looks out for each other.
In the 1960s, Beenham would have been a quiet village. We never got called up to there for any problems at all.
Early in the morning of Saturday, the 29th of October in 1966, police received a call about a missing 17-year-old au pair called Yolande Waddington.
Yolande had only been working at the farm as an au pair for a matter of days before she went missing and was then reported missing by her employer.
At the same time, a discovery was made on land belonging to the farm where Yolande was a nanny.
Some clothing was found in a barn by one of the farm workers. He thought no more of it because previously other clothes had been found there. It was a location used by courting couples.
Unaware of the clothing, police spread the word about the missing 17-year-old.
The following day, further items of clothing were also found within the barn when farm workers went and moved some bales of hay. At that point, Yolande had been reported missing, so the fact that the clothing was found in the barn reasonably close to where she was living raised suspicions, and her employer was called to the scene.
It didn't take long before everyone's worst nightmares were realised.
On the 30th of October, a body was found by her employer in a ditch close by to the barn where her clothing was found. She was naked, or almost naked. Her hands had been tied behind her back with twine, or baling twine. She had an item of clothing wrapped around her face and stuffed into her mouth. She had an injury to her rib cage just below her left breast, and she also had baling twine wrapped around her neck. And it was that what killed her.
1966 was a time before DNA and databases. All they had was good old-fashioned police work.
It was obvious from the outset that it was a murder, and it was treated as such.
Rodney Watson and Gary Deacon were local PCs at that time.
A telephone call came in to the effect that a body had been found in a ditch in a farm track at Beanham. It was quickly established that we had received a report of a missing girl called Yolandi Waddington, and as a result, I, amongst others, went to the scene to secure the scene.
Murders weren't known in those days as such, so everybody was sort of rushing around trying to get things organised, and I had to go to sort of do the search that was going to be taking place at the scene. We were greeted with open fields, rural tracks, the barn down the road, and farm tracks, and basically all rural area. We were searching at the time with sort of what would be garden instruments, the rake, hose, garden forks, shears for cutting the grass.
The atmosphere at the scene was quite sombre. Obviously, it was realised that the body in the ditch was a female and matched the description of Yolandi Waddington, and she'd obviously passed away.
You'd read about it in textbooks and everything, and you'd done it at a training school, but to be actually involved in a murder search was an experience.
I actually conveyed Yolandi Waddington to the Royal Berkshire Hospital, to the mortuary. I mean, I was thinking, you know, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
Identified by her employer, police were dispatched to give Yolandi Waddington's family the horrific news. Giles, Yolanda's younger brother, was 8 in 1966.
But I do recall this picture of opening the front door and finding a policeman in his full sort of uniform standing in front of me going, "I need to speak to your mum and dad." And that's the only real record I have. And then I have recollections of lots of people being in the house that were a bit unusual. And I would assume, in that case, there were various detectives.
This had been Yolanda's first job away from the family home in Newbury, and despite only being in Beanham a few days, she was known as a friendly, talkative girl. News of the murder travelled through this country village fast.
I can remember the police presence. There were suddenly lots of policemen everywhere. When you came out of school or if you went to the village shop, there were policemen around, and it is quite memorable, something like that. It did change the village at the time then.
Berkshire was really a rural county, and apart from the normal problems that you had, maybe the occasional pub fights at the weekend, murders were unknown as such.
A call was made to London.
In 1966, it was standard practice for the Berkshire Constabulary to request the assistance of a Detective Chief Superintendent and a Detective Sergeant from the Metropolitan Police.
And it was felt that Metropolitan officers had the necessary experience and expertise in order to lead on these rare and serious offences.
With Scotland Yard on the scene, the investigation continued.
In the following days, a thorough search took place of the barn and the immediate area. Various items were seized. Sacks from within the barn, Yolandi's clothing, a comb was found. A knife was found, which was believed to have been the knife that caused her injury.
The items were sent to the Metropolitan Police Lab in London for analysis, and then officers concentrated on piecing together Yolandi's final movements.
Yolandi Waddington was last seen on Friday the 28th of October 1966 in the Six Bells public house, Beanham. She'd gone in there to buy a packet of cigarettes. She appears to have smoked one of the cigarettes within the bar and then left. That was the last time she was seen. It was always felt, I believe, that the offender would have lived in and around the Beanham area because of the isolated nature of where Yolandi was found and the fact where she was last seen within the village centre. And therefore, investigators felt that the answer to who was responsible laid within the village. Everyone within the village was interviewed. The inquiry centred on who was within the Six Bells at the time she was, who left shortly after she did, and if they did leave, where did they go?
During their inquiries, officers began unearthing information that could prove crucial to capturing Yolandi's killer.
The landlady of the Six Bells was interviewed. She remembers selling a packet of cigarettes to a girl fitting Yolandi's description. A man by the name of David Burgess was in the pub at the same time Yolandi was there. He'd been there the majority of the evening and left shortly after she did.
Just days after the brutal murder of teenager Yolandi Waddington, police already had a suspect. In 1966, the rural village of Beanham in Berkshire was left reeling when the body of 17-year-old au pair Yolandi Waddington was found naked and strangled in a farm ditch. Local police had been bolstered by the arrival of the Met Scotland Yard. Items belonging to Yolandi found at the scene had immediately been sent for analysis, and after a few days, they already had a suspect, a local man called David Burgess.
He was of interest because he was in the pub, the Six Bells, at the time Yolandi was there, and left shortly after she did. The following day, he was seen with scratches on his face. He stated that he'd fallen into a bush on his way home. Police spoke to him. He stated he had been in the Six Bells and then had walked home from the Six Bells.
With nothing else to go on, 19-year-old local lad David Burgess was released, and the investigation moved on.
Everyone within the village was interviewed to establish where they were on the Friday that Yolandi went missing.
Over the next few weeks, the usually quiet village of Beanham was a hive of police activity as they hunted Yolandi's murderer.
I can remember the parents being really quite concerned of us kids going out to play, and the people in the village were quite scared.
At the time, our school was just down at the end of the lane there, and we used to just run up the lane and round and home. But once this happened, then all the mums were always at the school to meet us and walk us home. The police presence outside the hall, they were always there every day, which was obviously quite strange for Beanham to have so many police around.
There's always ripples to any murder, but in a very small community, I think that those ripples are felt very, very keenly. Immediately, you start to look at your neighbour and feel suspicious, and immediately there's a fear, and a fear of people who are close to you and known to you. This is not the kind of thing that happens to us. It's the kind of thing that we read about in newspapers or we watch in plots on TV or in Hollywood films.
After almost 2 weeks of inquiries, where over 1,000 statements were taken, Yolandi's clothing and effects had been analysed. The results were to send the investigation in a direction that would end up making history.
During the investigation at the barn, her jumper was found. On that jumper was blood. When that blood was examined, it was found not to be hers. Following that, it was decided to request blood from every person, every male, over the age of 16 that lived in and around Beenham.
This was a bold move by police, as the science behind it was in its infancy.
Limitations of forensic science testing in the 1960s basically revolved around the limitations of testing for blood. We knew that there were 4 blood groups, and you could break it down a little bit more, but you could never rule somebody conclusively in as a suspect. You could only rule them conclusively out.
Progress, though, had recently been made.
In 1966, 2 forensic serologists working for the Metropolitan Police came up with what they thought would be a new technique that could be used for forensic applications. The new application would help to further distinguish individuals on the basis of their blood.
By early November 1966, police decided to push on with what became the first mass blood screening ever attempted in the UK.
Posters were put around the village inviting men over 16 to give blood, and also showing a knife similar to the one found in the barn. Following the publication of those photos, David Burgess approached an officer within the village and told him that he had once owned a knife very similar to that.
Yolande's murder would have been very big news in a very small village. So here is a concerned citizen who is giving police information about a knife that they've recently lost. That's very helpful, but it becomes slightly more suspicious when you also factor into account that Burgess was also the last person to see Yolande alive.
Before a single blood sample had been taken, David Burgess had re-emerged as the police's main suspect.
David Burgess was arrested. In interview, he stuck to his story. The fact that he was in the pub, he couldn't dispute that because other customers had seen him. And the scratches, he explained those by saying he'd fallen into a bush on his way home because he'd had too much to drink.
Despite letting him go again, David Burgess, who worked at the local gravel pits and was already known to the police as a troublemaker, soon became the subject of gossip amongst the local bobbies.
I was kept abreast of things through snippets of colleagues who were undertaking the parts of the inquiry teams, and it became obvious that David Burgess was the chief suspect, although it was proving difficult to back up his claims with actually corroborative evidence.
Frustrated they couldn't prove Burgess's guilt, police continued looking into other local men.
My dad actually got arrested for the murder for Yolande, because what happened was the bus stop used to be outside the Six Bells pub, and he was in the pub and he had a Land Rover, and he said to her, because he was tipping down around, sit in my Land Rover while you wait for the bus. And somebody must have clocked that, and he got arrested and taken in, but in the next day was released, so they know he never done it.
There are 16 men that were of particular interest to the investigation. However, one by one, those men were eliminated.
With the investigation floundering, police still had what they hoped would be the ace up their sleeve. On November the 23rd, 1966, blood samples were taken from every male between the ages of 16 and 50 living in Beenham.
In excess of 200 men had their blood taken. The type of blood grouping that was done was new.
This case was certainly one of the first times that mass blood screening was used. The most well-known instance happened in the 1980s, but this predates it by at least 20 years.
Police were hoping that identifying whose blood was on Yolande's jumper would lead them to her killer.
They were able to say that only 2% of the population would have had blood of that type, and that was borne out by the fact that out of in excess of 200 men that gave their blood, only 4 people had the same blood grouping as that found on Yolande's jumper.
Police were desperately hoping David Burgess was one of them.
It wasn't his blood on the jumper, or his blood didn't appear to match the grouping that was found on Yolande's jumper, so there wasn't a great deal more that the police could do. With the 4 men whose blood matched the grouping of the blood found on Yolande's jumper, they were all subject of intense investigation. All of them had alibis for what they were doing, and therefore were ruled out of the investigation.
It had been a massive gamble to take this unprecedented step in the investigation. Unfortunately, it hadn't paid off, and the police were back to square one.
The investigation were obviously limited as to what they could do forensically. They did all they could in relation to try and show who was at the scene with Yolande, but back in 1966, they couldn't progress it.
With no new evidence coming to light, there was a difficult decision to make.
The investigation finished in March 1967. The officers had done all they could to try and establish who was responsible for Yolande's death, but unfortunately, after almost 6 months, they had no evidence that could be used to charge someone with her death.
I imagine that the killer would be feeling that they'd gotten away with it, they'd been successful, and they'd be feeling quite a thrill from that. They'd be feeling empowered and invincible.
The investigation was never officially closed, and suspicions remained about David Burgess. But for now, the evidence from the scene was stored for future analysis. Despite all the police's efforts, the murder of Yolande Waddington remained unsolved. After 6 months, the investigation into the murder of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington had been stopped. The village of Beenham looked as if it was going to be living with a killer on the loose for the foreseeable future. Inquiries may have ended, but despite there not being a match in the UK's first mass blood screening, local troublemaker David Burgess remained the police's prime suspect. This was a village on the edge. On the 17th of April 1967, the village of Beenham hit the news again.
We've got another call come in to say that 2 9-year-old girls hadn't returned home after going out to play in the village of Beenham. And we all thought, no, this cannot be. Surely nothing's happened to them. But I attended with a lot of officers, probably 20 to 30, and volunteers from the village. And we searched the area by some gravel pits, and having been issued with the whistles to blow if anything was found, after about half an hour or so, somebody blew a whistle.
The whistle could mean only one thing.
When the call came in to say 2 bodies had been found, then you get a bit disheartened, you think, how sad. And it was a lonely area, these 2 young children as they were out there on their own, and something had happened. Devastating, really, yes.
The awful news reverberated around the village.
We were really in shock, and the teachers were in shock, parents were in shock, and it was really quite scary, actually.
Police quickly got to work. They were determined that this murder would not go unsolved.
It was obvious that these 2 girls had been murdered, so an investigation took place.
It wasn't long before police had a person of interest, and the name didn't come as much of a surprise.
Because David Burgess was one of the main suspects in Yolande's case, the fact that he worked so close to where the bodies of the 2 9-year-olds were found made him a strong suspect almost from the outset. He was interviewed, his clothing was seized, and from one of his boots some blood was found, and that blood grouping matched one of the girls.
David Burgess was charged with the monstrous killing of the 2 9-year-old girls, Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams.
We'd heard that Burgess had been arrested on the possibility of committing the murders of the 2 schoolgirls, and I suppose we were all really delighted.
In July of 1967, just 4 months after the horrific killings of Jeanette and Jacqueline, David Burgess was presented at Reading Crown Court accused of their murder. It was a swift, uncomplicated hearing.
Burgess stood trial and was convicted of both the murders of both 9-year-olds in July 1967.
Escorted to his life sentence by Rodney Watson, Burgess's behaviour was, under the circumstances, bizarre.
And I was handcuffed to him in the dock, but most of the time he didn't really seem worried about what was happening. He kept on looking round, occasionally laughing, chuckling to himself, and not really worried about proceedings. And a very strange person I found to be in that position. I would have been worried myself. And then he was remanded in custody and then taken down and then released into the prison authorities. And that was the last time I ever saw him, in fact.
Now, I know that when I assess psychopaths, some of the things that I look for are callousness, lack of empathy, but just a general blunting of emotional response and effect. Now, here is somebody who is acting very oddly indeed. We know that he's not got a mental illness, but you have to question what else is going on.
Rodney's macabre introduction to the darker side of police work was over. But there was still one question that remained unanswered. Who had murdered Yolandi Waddington? In 1968, a potential answer came from prison.
David Burgess admitted to being responsible for causing Yolandi's death to a prison officer, and that prison officer subsequently made a statement to police.
Could the man who police had always suspected of Yolandi's depraved murder be confessing?
On April 3rd, 1968, Burgess was interviewed in prison by police officers in relation to the admissions he'd made concerning Yolandi's death. To those officers, he said words to the effect of, "You'll have to prove it."
The fact that somebody was prepared to indulge in this sort of conversation and admissions and them saying you prove it as if it was some sort of game, totally disrespectful to the girl and the family and the family of the two other girls.
In talking about Yolandi's murder and taking responsibility for that murder, Burgess is meeting two needs. First of all, he's letting people know how clever he is because he's got away with murder. But also, crucially, he's re-engaging with that murder and re-engaging with the emotions that that murder brought about in him. So he's feeling powerful, he's feeling a thrill. And let's face it, when you're incarcerated, there are very few other outlets for that type of thing. If you can't commit a murder, you talk about a murder.
Police decided to test Burgess's blood one more time.
Following his admissions, the jumper was tested yet again in relation to the blood found, and a report was submitted to the Director of Prosecutions. However, the blood grouping still didn't match that of Burgess, and as a result of that, the Director of Prosecutions stated that he didn't believe it was worthwhile pursuing the charge against Burgess.
It was a bitter blow, and it was looking like Yolandi's murder was never going to be solved. In 1996, 48-year-old convicted double child murderer David Burgess absconded from open prison.
At one point, Burgess was on the run for in the region of 18 months and took over the identity of someone that he knew that had died. Was subsequently arrested when he committed an armed robbery. We don't know where he was throughout the 18 months.
Sexual offending by its nature is addictive, and here is an individual who would be at very high risk of reoffending. But that's not to say that other murders would be inevitable, although they are possible.
When I heard that he'd escaped from an open prison, my thoughts were, how could somebody who's killed two 9-year-old girls be deemed safe to allow it out into the public?
By February 1998, David Burgess was back in prison, whilst Beanham tried to get back to normal. But the village always had a cloud hanging over it.
There's a very good history of Beanham, which was written by the local history group some 10 years ago now, but it doesn't mention the murders.
It was a subject that was almost taboo.
I would say I would very rarely hear anyone talking about it here in the pub.
As many tried to forget, Giles, Yolandi's younger brother, was just finding out the full horror of what had happened to his sister.
I discovered a pile of press cuttings hidden away out of view. Obviously being put away so that I didn't find them, but I did, and there was this sort of Yolande's photograph plastered on the front page, and there were sort of police and other sort of articles. So I found out a little bit to know that my sister had been murdered.
With David Burgess safely back behind bars, advances were being made in DNA analysis, meaning previously unsolved murders were worth revisiting.
In 1985, research published at the University of Leicester proved that new DNA analysis techniques could be used to link specific individuals to offences, and has since been used in many different capacities to solve homicides and sexual assault cases.
This breakthrough led to cold case units being set up by police forces around the country.
I retired in 2007 and then came back in my current role as a member of police staff, reinvestigating historic cases.
Eventually, in September 2010, the Thames Valley Major Crime Review Team turned their attention to the unsolved murder of Yolande Waddington.
So with Yolande's case, we initially looked at what the case was about, looked at what case papers we had, and importantly what exhibits we had, and did an audit of those exhibits to see what was still in existence, and then did an assessment as to what potential there was to use new forensic techniques on those exhibits.
Could advances in forensic sciences finally help police find Yolande's killer 44 years after her murder? Up until 2010, the 1966 murder of Yolande Waddington remained unsolved, despite the police believing that double child murderer David Burgess had been responsible from the very beginning. Then Thames Valley Police decided to reopen Yolande's case to see if DNA could identify and convict her killer. The new investigation began by finding out what evidence had survived.
We had items that were found in the barn, some items of her clothing, but importantly, what was missing was the oatmeal jumper that Yolande was wearing at the time of her death. That was an item from which a bloodstain was found, which wasn't hers, and it was that bloodstain, the grouping from that bloodstain, which was used on the initial investigation to get the blood grouping with which to match against people from within the village.
As the only item belonging to Yolande with someone else's blood on it, the missing jumper was a big blow.
There were another key items that still did exist, and it was those that we were able to submit to the forensic laboratories for further work to take place.
By January 2011, police managed to recover Yolande's headband and a plastic fertiliser bag. Now it was up to the lab to find DNA not belonging to Yolande.
We here at LGC have a cold case team that is dedicated just to cold cases. We'll use whatever available technology is there in order to try and help solve the case.
Locating the evidence was only half the battle. Usable DNA needed to be found.
One of the most important items was the polythene fertiliser bag that was found at the scene of the crime. Because the original note suggested there was blood on there, and obviously they'd got blood grouping results from that item. So we went back to it, and sure enough, there were still crusty bloodstains on that item. We then sampled some of those stains and carried out DNA profiling on them and got a good profile.
The lab was quick to give Thames Valley Police the news.
And they said that they had a profile. That profile, a DNA profile that is, that profile was then searched against the National DNA Database, and there was a match against David Burgess.
Already in prison for double murder, David Burgess was in the frame again. But it did pose the question, why hadn't he been a match when he was tested in 1966 or 68?
I would have expected him to match. It if the test had been carried out correctly. And unfortunately, we can't go back and recheck that particular test, and we don't have any documentation in order to see whether there might have been a transcription error, a problem in moving information of the actual type onto another page that was used in a report, for example.
As far as the team were concerned, Burgess's blood had been incorrectly categorised in the 60s. But persuading a jury of this wouldn't be easy. They had to use the DNA to prove that the blood had always belonged to Burgess.
Although it was good evidence to have Burgess's DNA on that sack, the problem we had was that he was a local young man, would have had ready access to that barn, so we had to get evidence over and above that, because potentially he could have just said, yes, that's my DNA, I'm local, so what?
Roy Green and his team at LGC continued investigating the evidence.
As we looked through the old case notes that were prepared over 40 years previously, we noticed that one of them, the headband, had a description of it saying grubby, and that was it. But on examining the item, we found that what were thought to be grubby marks were actually blood. The DNA profiling results showed that there was a mixture of DNA on the headband. Some of it could have come from Yolandi, and that's to be expected because it was her item. But also, some of it could have come from David Burgess.
If Burgess's DNA was definitely on the headband, it would show that he'd come into direct contact with Yolandi. Police had to prove beyond any doubt that the DNA was his.
We had to refer to a specialist in genetic statistics at UCL, and he was able to say that, in his opinion, the DNA profile found on her headband was a 1 in a billion match probability to Burgess.
A 1 billion to 1 match was conclusive proof that Burgess and Yolandi had had physical contact. It was time to let the surviving members of Yolandi's family know what was happening.
I tend to try and only make contact with the family when we have new evidence, which hopefully will bring their case to a successful conclusion. In Yolandi's case, I approached Giles, her brother.
There wasn't a sort of sense of relief, a sense of... I can't say that I felt anything. It's a process. And it still feels as though it's a process, because it makes no difference to the end result. Yolandi is dead, never to be alive again. The bit that I was worried about was the impact it would have on my dad in his twilight days.
For the police, turning failed investigations around wasn't just about pride.
Each one of our undetected cases has obviously a victim and the victim's family. The impact on families is massive, in as much that it's difficult to comprehend what that family's gone through. And when we visit them sort of 10, 20, 30 years after the event, you can still see the impact, in as much that there's a picture of their loved one, either on the television, on the mantelpiece, and it never goes away. It's something that they think about every day.
My parents were certainly not wanting a repeat. Well, their trust in anybody disappeared, evaporated completely, for the simple reason that their precious daughter had been taken from them.
Pete Byrne and his team had to put together a case to back up the DNA.
It's really, really pleasing to get the forensic result, but that's just the start of it, really. From that moment on, we then have to look at the case and build the case up against Burgess.
Police had to painstakingly trawl through all the evidence from 1966 and find the original witnesses.
They were all seen, if they were still alive, interviewed, asked in relation to their initial statement whether they wanted to add, alter or correct anything in relation to what they'd said back in '66 to what they could remember in 2011.
In November 2011, the prime suspect in 17-year-old Nanny Yolandi Waddington's murder was interviewed about some of the original evidence from 1966 that had implicated him.
Did you get those scratches because Yolandi scratched your face?
I had nothing whatsoever to do with her death. I've told you that, and you won't believe it because I'm a liar, you said. We're saying the knife that you lost is identical, you say you lost, is identical to the knife that was used to murder Yolanda Waddington. That's a coincidence, isn't it? Your missing knife is the same knife How that many
Mm.
was people in Venham had a knife similar? How many people? Are they all suspects, aren't they?
Finally, Burgess was asked about his confession to prison guards.
And you thought it was safe to say that here?
No.
It was safe, wasn't it?
I'd never say something like that if I committed a murder. I wouldn't go around shouting about it.
After we finished interviewing Burgess and he was charged, we then carried on building the case up against him, putting the file in to the CPS, and then getting ready for the trial.
45 years after he'd first been the main suspect in Yolandi Waddington's brutal killing, David Burgess was going to stand trial for her murder.
It's not every day that you get told that your sister's murderer has just been arrested. It was a sort of sense of, wow, that's progress, and significant progress.
On the 18th of June 2012, David Burgess stood trial at Reading Crown Court.
I was confident in the results that we'd obtained, but in the background there was always this mistyping of the original blood grouping results that could be a potential stumbling block.
If the defence could sway the court into believing there was no way that the 2 blood tests done on Burgess in the 60s could have been wrong, he'd get off the murder of Yolandi yet again. It was a difficult time for Giles.
There is no provision whatsoever for, or any preparation that can prepare anybody for facing a trial as a victim's relative.
For David Burgess, it all seemed nothing more than an inconvenience.
I saw him throughout the trial. His attitude didn't seem to have changed at all from when we'd first interviewed him. He just simply appeared bored by the whole proceedings.
The jury and Giles were told all the grisly details.
The fact that she'd been found naked, her clothes had been strewn about, she'd been stabbed, she'd been strangled, the whole thing had been a sexual crime. And that's the bit that was uncomfortable because I found it out for the first time.
Through expert witnesses, the prosecution explained how the original blood tests must have been wrong, and more witnesses called.
One of the key points of the trial was a witness that we'd located in Australia who was living in Beenham just prior to the murder. She gave evidence to the effect that Burgess had attacked her one evening prior to the attack on Yolandi. We were able to use that evidence, what's called bad character evidence, put that before the jury to show the type of man Burgess was.
Once all the witnesses found by Pete Byrne and his team had given evidence, there was only the DNA left.
We're fortunate that the scientist was able to explain to the jury in layman's terms what that DNA consisted of and how he was confident that the DNA that was found on the items belonged to Burgess.
In the end, everything relied upon the jury understanding the complex evidence.
The trial lasted 5 weeks in total. The jury were out for 5 days, after which they came back with an 11-1 majority verdict that Burgess was the killer.
On the 23rd of July 2012, almost half a century after Yolandi Waddington's murder, David Burgess was sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. It was a huge relief to Giles.
For want of the better expression, shouted from the rooftops to say, no matter how old the crime, the resources are now there to provide justice now.
He should be 92 years of age when he's released. I don't think he should ever be released.
Burgess is clearly a sexually motivated repeat killer, and you do wonder how his killing career would have been progressing had he not been caught. But as a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
We're very, very pleased that we got the result. But that's what me and my team do. We reinvestigate the historic cases that are unresolved.
Burgess was sent back to prison, but questions were raised about the 18 months he'd been on the run.
We made sure that the forces were also made aware that there was a convicted killer that potentially could have committed offences anywhere within the UK within that time, so we passed on his details to other forces.
By the time Burgess is eligible for parole, he will have spent 73 years behind bars for the 3 murders the police know he's committed. The question is, are there more?
Join the team and face the day-to-day struggle of stamping out crime. Leave it to the experts, Saturday at 10 in the Force Northeast.
To adults, a decade might not seem like a long time. It might feel like it passes in an instant. However, my daughter, who was once a primary school student, is now old enough to be a working adult. My husband, Paul, who left us on his own will, has been staying at his parents' house for a decade now, failing to fulfill his duties as a father. My mother-in-law, who allowed this, is the same. Even if I were proposed a house where all our generations could live together, what they probably would want from me is nothing but to be their housekeeper. It's too late now. Even if they start acting friendly upon sensing money. I have spent a decade raising my child alone. Unlike you, I haven't wasted my time. My name is Judy, 53 years old, a full-time housewife with a part-time job. My only daughter, Hannah, who commutes to university from home, recently received a job offer and will start working next year. I'm worried about her as she is still oblivious about the world, but I am happy that she has grown up well. Raising a child felt like it went by in a flash, but I still have her student loan to repay. For over 20 years, I have prioritized my daughter, but I wonder what my life will be like from now on. It might be nice to travel, enjoy hobbies, or join the gym I've always wanted to go to. However, right about this time, both of my parents passed away. Their death was sudden, caused by a rear-end collision, killing them both on the spot. It was so sudden that I had no time to mourn, busy with funeral preparations and inheritance matters. After the meeting with the tax accountant was over and things seemed to have calmed down, I finally burst into tears and suddenly realized I should let my husband know. I picked up my phone and called him. There was no response. Of course, he wouldn't answer. I knew that. I had tried several times before the funeral, but he did not respond. I sent messages, but there was no reply. After several attempts, I got busy and forgot about him. More than a week had passed. I don't consider myself heartless for not thinking about my husband at such a time. In fact, it's been years since my husband stopped coming home. He's not missing. He's living at his parents' house. Since he left the house of his own accord, he has kept his distance from me. At times it can be troublesome and annoying if you can't get in contact. If there is an emergency, I can only leave a message with his parents' home phone. I was puzzled when my husband first left. I don't really know why he left, since he refused to talk to me about it. But I could care less about the reason once I was caught up with childcare and a full-time job. I felt it was pointless to try to understand someone who would go to such lengths to abandon his family. From the beginning of our marriage, he had prioritized his own family more than us. We argued about this many times. Even if I emphasized repeatedly that we had our own family to protect, he would break his promises whenever his mother would ask him for a favor. It didn't matter if we had prepared to go out or booked a trip. Still, I felt he tried to contribute to the family when our daughter was young. But when our daughter reached teenage years and her attitude towards her father became colder, his mother suddenly hurt her back. That year, there was a lot of snow, and my daughter and I had caught colds. He said he would help out at his parents' house for a while, since it was a difficult time for his mother, but he never came back. How a husband who couldn't handle household chores at all was useful? I don't know, but my mother-in-law kept him there, saying it was okay for him to stay as long as he liked, pampering him. The overprotective and overly interfering mother-in-law was spoiling her grown-up son. As a result, my husband couldn't escape the luxury of living at his parents' home. To my mother-in-law, I was the bad daughter-in-law who stole her precious son. Their behavior truly was unreasonable and unbearable. Since I had no choice, I contacted my husband's parents' house. The one who picked up the phone, however, was my mother-in-law. "Hello, Mother, it's Judy. Is Paul there? I can't get in touch with him. What's wrong? I need to speak to him. Can you put him on the line, please? What do you need to talk to him about? I'll let him know." This was the usual exchange. Because of this, I haven't had a direct conversation with my husband in years. Actually, my parents have passed away. What? Considering the current situation, we held the funeral with only close family and friends. Why didn't you tell me such an important thing immediately? I tried several times. I can't believe this. How could you lack such common sense? I had no idea what she was talking about. What exactly does she mean by common sense? Outrageous. Why would you wait to tell me until after the funeral is over? That's why you're... By the way, what will you do with your parents' house? We're gathering as a family this weekend to sort things out. Then my mother-in-law paused for a moment and said, "The big house." Yes, it might take some time since the house is huge. I see. My mother-in-law laughed ominously. Do you have something to say? No, not at all. It's nothing. Is that so? Then I'll excuse myself. After hanging up, my daughter Hannah looked at me with concern. Are you okay? You look upset. There's no need to force yourself to contact Grandma or Dad. You're too diligent, Mom. My daughter said with worry. It's not that simple. You have way too much sense of obligation, Mom. Hearing my daughter's concern, I responded, I just don't want to be thought of as unreasonable. Inside, I was raging with anger. I even thought it might be better to just cut ties with them. However, to my daughter, he still is her one and only father. It wasn't that easy to sever ties with them. The weekend arrived, and me and my daughter went to my family home. My siblings took care of the cleanup, and everyone played their roles, progressing steadily. Clearing out a house that no one has lived in was harder than I had imagined. We decided to leave the larger furniture and appliances to a professional service. All of a sudden, I received a call from my mother-in-law. It was rare for her to contact me. "Judy, how's the cleanup going? Is everything all right?" My mother-in-law asked cheerfully. It's as if she had some good news. She continued, "Actually, I'm busy with something urgent right now and won't be able to make it today. Sorry for that. I didn't expect her to come over to help anyways. We've barely seen each other since my husband left, so why would she suddenly say such a thing? I don't think she knows the location of my family home either. It's okay. Please don't worry about it. Don't be shy. We're family, so it's natural to help each other out. Is this some strange twist of fate?" Normally self-centered, my mother-in-law seemed to show some sort of understanding for the situation. I decided to genuinely accept her feelings. By the way, when you said you're tidying up the house, you mean sorting through belongings, right? Yes, there are so many things, and it's quite a hassle, right? It must be difficult to be surrounded by so many things. Yes, especially with dresses and artworks. It's really challenging when there are items that we don't know what to do with them. I see. That sounds wonderful. I started to feel cold as I caught a glimpse of my mother-in-law's true intentions. I was a fool to think she was genuinely concerned. How could she possibly have been concerned with not being able to help? Is that all you wanted to discuss? Actually, I was genuinely curious as to how much your parents left you behind. What? Well, it's my turn next, after all. I just wanted to know, merely for reference. That varies from one family to another. Well, yes, but it wouldn't hurt to tell me a little, would it? I couldn't contain my irritation. During the 10 years we haven't met, did my mother-in-law grow old and become more audacious and greedy? My parents had instructed in their will that the inheritance be divided equally among us siblings. Needless to say, my mother-in-law has no right to interfere. Let's make this clear. The inheritance will be divided into 3, so it has nothing to do with you, Mother. What? I'm busy right now, so I'll excuse myself. With that, I ended the call. Her attitude was extremely rude. My parents had passed away, and she didn't offer condolences, only inquired about the inheritance. Then, my daughter, who had been tidying up another room, came over. Was that Grandma on the phone? Yes, it was. What happened? Nothing for you to worry about. I replied with a wry smile, and my daughter looked slightly displeased. I'm an adult now, you know. Stop treating me like a child. I hadn't meant it that way, but her assertive response surprised me a bit. Indeed, she is now of an age to be treated as a full-fledged adult. I felt a mix of happiness and an indescribable sense of loneliness. Mom, I know what's going on. What do you mean? If my guess is right, I want you to make one promise. A promise? What kind? That's when I made a special promise with my daughter. A week passed, the house cleanup was nearly finished, and I was thinking of returning to work when the doorbell rang. Thinking it was the delivery guy, I opened the door to an annoying long time no see. I should have checked first. If I had known, I wouldn't have opened the door. There stood my mother-in-law and... Who was that next to her? A loose, unshapely figure with thin hair fluttering in the breeze. Was this middle-aged man, wearing a stretched-out sweatshirt looking filthy, really my spouse, Paul? I stared in disbelief at first and said, "You've got the wrong address." As I was about to close the door, my mother-in-law said, "Don't joke around, Judy." Breaking the silence and visiting without any prior announcement. What did these two want? And most of all, why was my mother-in-law in such high spirits? Despite never allowing any space between her and her beloved son, my mother-in-law breezed past me and entered the room with confidence. "Wait, Mother." My husband followed her in, entering my property without asking. Maybe he didn't need permission since it was his home too. But the 10-year gap had practically made him a stranger to me. And I certainly didn't want to welcome this unsightly man into my home. "I have a surprise for you, Judy." "I thought you'd be pleased," my mother-in-law cheerily said. My husband sat down next to my mother-in-law. "Oh, I'd like some coffee, please." "Paul, how about you?" "I'll have tea." "Judy, please bring us some." I couldn't stand not just my mother-in-law's behavior, but my husband's as well. How can a man who left home without a word, spent 10 years at his parents' house, sending only a small amount for living expenses, and never contacting us,